What if the biggest mistake of your life happened in front of 500 people, and you didn't even know it yet? On a cold Tuesday morning in October, billionaire Amelia Sterling stood at the front of her own auction hall and laughed. She laughed at a dusty, forgotten race car that nobody wanted. She laughed at the quiet man in the oil-stained jacket who raised his paddle to buy it. She laughed at $11,500. $8 million later, she wasn't laughing anymore. This is the story of what happens when the wrong person gets underestimated. Stay until the end. Drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The alarm on Mason Brooks' phone went off at 5:14 in the morning, which was 16 minutes before it was supposed to. He lay there for a moment, staring at the water stain on the bedroom ceiling that he'd been meaning to patch for about 11 months. It looked vaguely like the state of Texas. He'd named it Texas. Emma thought that was hilarious. Emma was 6, so a lot of things were hilarious to her, including the word spatula and the fact that their neighbor's dog was named Gerald. Mason sat up slowly. His right shoulder ached the way it always did in October, when the temperature in Brooklyn dropped enough to remind every old injury exactly where it lived. He'd torn something in that shoulder when he was 24, working underneath a lifted truck that shifted on an unsteady jack. He'd been lucky it wasn't worse. His father had told him that, standing in the hospital hallway with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, trying not to show how scared he'd been. You were lucky, Mason. Lucky doesn't come twice the same way. Remember that. He remembered it. He patted down the hallway in socked feet, pushed open the door to Emma's room just wide enough to confirm she was still breathing, a habit he hadn't been able to shake since she was a newborn, and then went downstairs to make coffee. The apartment above the garage wasn't much. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that smelled permanently of motor oil no matter how many times he scrubbed the walls, and a living room where Emma's drawings covered every available surface. She was going through a horse phase. There were horses on the refrigerator, horses taped to the bathroom mirror, 3 different horses on the front door with their names written underneath in crayon. Biscuit, Star, and one simply labeled the fast one. Mason didn't own any horses. He owned a 2009 Ford F-150 with a cracked dashboard and a 1994 Honda Civic that he'd been restoring in the garage for 3 years and probably would be for 3 more. He also owned, technically, the garage itself, though the bank had a strong opinion about that. He poured his coffee, stood at the kitchen window, and looked out at the street below. A delivery truck was idling at the corner. A woman was walking a very old, very slow basset hound named, he was guessing, something dignified. The city was waking up in its usual way, indifferent and continuous, like a machine that never got turned off. He had an auction to get to. Mason had found out about the Sterling estate auction 6 weeks earlier through a client named Darnell who brought his Escalade in every 3 months and always talked too much while he waited. You hear about the Sterling thing? Darnell had said, sitting on the plastic chair in the waiting area and scrolling through his phone. Big auction. Estate stuff, cars, furniture, whatever. Amelia Sterling, the tech money girl. She's liquidating some property her family had in upstate New York. Old barn, old house, all that. Mason had been under the Escalade at the time, checking a brake line. I've heard the name. She's like 30. Youngest woman on the Forbes list 2 years running. Sharp as hell, I'll give her that. But she's got that thing where she doesn't know what she doesn't know. You know what I'm saying? Mason hadn't known what Darnell was saying exactly, but he'd written down the auction details on the back of a parts receipt and stuck it to the refrigerator when he got upstairs that evening. His father had spent 30 years cataloging rare American race cars, not as a professional historian, not as a collector with deep pockets, just as a man who became obsessed with something and never let go of it. There were filing cabinets in Mason's storage unit that contained more information about obscure mid-century American motorsport than most university libraries. Cross-referenced by hand, indexed on index cards. Robert Brooks had been meticulous about it the way some men are meticulous about nothing in particular, because the thing itself is the point. He died 4 years ago, 14 months after Mason's wife, Carla, had died. The 2 losses had hit so close together that Mason sometimes couldn't tell them apart in his memory. They blurred into a single long year of casseroles from neighbors and Emma asking questions he didn't know how to answer. But the filing cabinets were still in storage. And Mason still read through them sometimes, on slow Sunday afternoons when Emma was watching cartoons, because it was the closest thing to a conversation with his father that he still had access to. One of the folders, Thin, labeled in his father's cramped handwriting, Project Spectre/Unverified, had always nagged at him. The Sterling property was in Dutchess County. His father's notes referenced a barn in Dutchess County. It was probably nothing. It was probably a coincidence, but he taped the auction flyer to the refrigerator anyway. Well, Emma did not want to go to school on the morning of the auction. This was not unusual. Emma's relationship with school was complicated. She loved her teacher, Mrs. Okafor, with a passion that bordered on devotion, but she had strong feelings about several of her classmates, specifically a boy named Tyler who had allegedly stolen her best marker and denied it with his whole chest, according to Emma. "I don't want to go," she announced, sitting at the kitchen table in front of a bowl of cereal she hadn't touched. "I know. Tyler's going to be there." "Tyler is always going to be there. That's how school works. It's not fair." "A lot of things aren't fair." Mason poured himself a second coffee, decided against it, and put the mug in the sink. "You still have to go." She considered this. Then, "Where are you going?" "An auction." "Like where they sell stuff?" "Yeah." "Are you going to buy something?" "Maybe. Probably not. I just want to look at something." Emma studied him with the focused skepticism that 6-year-olds deploy when they suspect an adult is not telling them the whole truth. She was good at that. She had Carla's eyes, dark brown, direct, not easily fooled. "What are you looking for?" Mason crouched down to her level, which he always did when he was going to say something he meant. "Something Grandpa thought was important. I want to see if he was right." Emma thought about that for a moment. She picked up her spoon. "Grandpa was usually right," she said. "Yeah," Mason said. "He was." He dropped her at school 20 minutes later. She walked through the front doors without looking back, which was what she always did. No lingering, no waving, just forward. He watched until the door closed behind her, then pulled out of the parking lot and pointed the F-150 north. The Sterling auction house didn't look like it belonged in a converted warehouse in Long Island City, but that's where it was, and it had been pulling in serious money for serious collectors for the better part of a decade. The building had been cleaned up enough to look intentional. Exposed brick, track lighting, staff in dark blazers moving quietly between display tables. Mason arrived 20 minutes before the doors opened and stood in line behind people who were dressed better than he was. He'd worn his cleanest jeans, a button-down shirt that had been ironed at some point in the past month, and work boots that were scuffed at the toes no matter what he did to them. He looked like what he was, a man from a garage who had driven north on a hunch. He got a catalog in the door, a numbered paddle that he held loosely at his side, and a small glass of water from a passing tray that he drank immediately because he was thirsty. The main hall was impressive in the way that spaces are impressive when a lot of money has been spent on making things look effortlessly expensive. High ceilings, cars on raised platforms under focused lighting, their paint catching and holding it like a performance. A 1967 Shelby GT 500 in the center that made 3 different men in the crowd audibly exhale. A pair of vintage Ferraris against the far wall that had already generated a small cluster of well-dressed admirers. Mason looked at all of it. And then he looked past all of it, to the back of the room, where the lighting was worse and the crowd was thinner and the air smelled different, dustier, older, less curated. There were several lots back there that clearly hadn't received the same attention as the featured pieces. An old farm tractor, a row of antique gas pumps, some rusted hand tools in bins, and then, shoved against the wall like an afterthought, under a canvas cover that had clearly been thrown over it in a hurry rather than placed with any care, a car, low, long. The canvas didn't quite reach the ground, and he could see the lower body panels, or what was left of them. The paint was gone in most places, replaced by surface rust and old primer. One wheel was a replacement, obviously wrong era, obviously somebody's quick fix from a long time ago. A piece of the front fascia was missing entirely, exposing the structural frame beneath. Everything about it said, "Don't bother." Mason walked over to it. He didn't touch it yet. He just looked. He walked the perimeter slowly, hands in his pockets, reading what he could from ground level. The roofline was low in a way that was specific. Not just aerodynamically low, but architecturally low, the way race prototypes were when they were built around a driver who was going to be lying almost flat. The wheelbase was longer than it looked because of the way the body panels concealed it. The rear haunches had a particular flair to them that he'd seen in photographs, but never in person. His heart was doing something uncomfortable in his chest. He pulled out his phone and opened the photos he'd transferred from his father's files 3 days ago, the night he'd decided to actually go to this thing. Grainy black and white photographs, taken on a 35mm camera sometime in the late 1950s, of a car that existed in exactly 3 known images in the world. He looked at the photographs. He looked at the car. He looked at the photographs again. "Can I lift the cover?" he asked the nearest staff member, a young woman with a clipboard who seemed slightly relieved that someone had expressed interest in this corner of the room. "Of course," she said. "I'll just note it in the log. Do you want the lot information?" "Please." Lot 47, provenance unknown, described in the catalog as vintage American racing vehicle, heavily modified/deteriorated, provenance unverified, sold as is. The estimate, the range they expected it to sell in, was listed as $8,000 to $15,000. He lifted the canvas cover. Up close, with the whole car visible, the feeling in his chest got worse. Or better. He wasn't sure which. The cockpit was open, the seat long gone, the instrumentation panel stripped to bare metal. But the shape of the dashboard, the curve of it, the angle at which it met the firewall, was unmistakable to anyone who'd spent time with his father's documentation. The steering column mount was in exactly the wrong position by conventional standards and exactly the right position by one specific set of engineering drawings that his father had obtained from a retired machinist in Ohio, who'd claimed to have worked on the original project for 6 weeks before the whole thing was shut down. Mason crouched and looked at the undercarriage. Filthy. 30 years of accumulated grime and old road debris. But underneath the grime, the frame rails had a characteristic cross-section that wasn't standard. Not Ford, not GM, not Chrysler, but something built specifically, expensively for one purpose. He stood up. "You need anything else?" the staff member asked. "The undercarriage. Can I get under it?" She blinked. "Under it? I just want to look at the frame. I'll be 30 seconds. She looked around, seemed to decide this fell somewhere in the acceptable range of behavior, and nodded. Mason lay down on the concrete floor, phone flashlight on, and looked at the bottom of the car. He found it almost immediately. Not the frame itself, but a stamp pressed into the metal near the transmission tunnel, partially obscured by old paint and oxidation, but legible if you knew what you were looking for. 2 letters. 3 numbers. A small geometric mark that looked like a diamond with a line through it. His father had written about that stamp, in the thin folder marked Unverified. He'd described it from second-hand accounts, from the machinist in Ohio, from a letter he'd received from a racing official who'd heard things at a dinner in 1978 and written them down on hotel stationery. The stamp was the internal designation used by the fabrication team for exactly one vehicle, a vehicle that had been reported destroyed in 1962. Mason stood up, brushed the concrete dust off his shirt, and stood there for a moment looking at the car. Lucky doesn't come twice the same way. "How much did you say the estimate was?" he asked. 8 to 15,000, the staff member said. "It's a bit of a wild card lot. Nobody's really shown interest." "Right," Mason said. "Thank you." He folded the catalog, put it under his arm, and went to find a spot to stand before the auction began. Amelia Sterling arrived 12 minutes before the auction started, and the room adjusted to her arrival the way rooms do when someone with genuine power walks into them, not through any dramatic entrance, but through a series of small recalibrations. People turned fractionally in her direction. Conversations paused mid-sentence. The staff moved slightly differently. She was shorter than Mason had expected from the photographs he'd seen online. Early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a way that was probably casual but had likely taken some thought, wearing a charcoal blazer over a plain dark shirt. She moved through the room with the efficiency of someone who had places to be and had learned not to waste motion getting there. She stopped near Lot 47 briefly, glancing at it the way people glance at a closed door, acknowledging its existence without any curiosity about what's on the other side. Then she said something to the man walking beside her, and he wrote something on his clipboard, and they moved on. Mason watched this. He was standing about 20 feet away, holding his water glass, and he watched Amelia Sterling dismiss the car in approximately 4 seconds without lifting the canvas, without crouching down, without asking a single question. He wasn't angry about it. He understood it. The car looked like garbage. If you didn't know what you were looking for, there was no reason to look. The auction opened at 10 o'clock. The featured cars went first, as they always do. Let the expensive stuff set the tone, get the money moving, make everyone feel the electricity of competition. The Shelby went for $340,000 to a man in the third row who raised his paddle with the calm of someone ordering coffee. The Ferraris went for considerably more, generating the kind of restrained applause that serious money produces when it changes hands among people who consider applause a bit gauche. Mason watched all of it from near the back wall next to lot 47. Then the auctioneer moved through the smaller lots. The tractor. The gas pumps. A collection of vintage oil cans that sold to a woman in the front row for $1,200. Lot 47, the auctioneer said, with the particular tone of someone who doesn't expect much from what they're introducing. Vintage American racing vehicle, as is, starting bid $5,000. Silence. 5,000. Do I have 5,000? Mason raised his paddle. 5,000, thank you. Do I have 6? More silence. Around him, people glanced at the car with the benign curiosity of passers-by looking at a minor traffic inconvenience. Someone near the front leaned over and said something to their companion, and the companion laughed quietly. 6,000? No? We'll go to the gentleman at 5,000 then. 6, said a voice from the left side of the room. Mason looked. A man in his 50s, gray at the temples, standing with his arms crossed, not really looking at the car, looking at Mason. The way some people bid at auctions, not because they want the thing, but because they don't like the idea of someone else getting it too easily. 6,000? 7? Mason. 7. The man. 8. A few more people in the room had tuned in now. Not many, but a few. The small drama of an unexpected bidding war on an ugly lot. 9, Mason said. The man looked at the car again. Really looked at it this time, as if trying to work out what this guy in the work boots knew that he didn't. He seemed to decide it wasn't worth finding out. Do I have 9,5? The auctioneer asked. Nothing. 9,000 once. 9,000 twice. 10, someone said from the other side of the room. A woman, mid-40s, bidding with the distracted air of someone who had wandered in from a different part of the building. Great, Mason thought. 11, he said. She shrugged. 11,5. 12. She paused, looked at the car, looked at Mason. Something in Mason's expression, the complete absence of uncertainty, seemed to give her pause. 12,5, she said, but less confidently. 13. She didn't bid again. 13,000. Do I have 13,5? From somewhere near the front, and this was the part Mason hadn't anticipated, he heard Amelia Sterling's voice, clear and dry, with the slight edge of someone who has spent years in rooms full of people trying to impress her and has become immune to it. Let me see it for a second, she said to no one in particular, which in her position meant to someone in particular. A staff member pulled back the canvas cover. Amelia looked at the car. She walked around it once, quickly, hands clasped behind her back, with the eye of someone who has been to enough auctions to recognize value when it's obvious, and whose blind spot is recognizing it when it isn't. It's a wreck, she said to the man with the clipboard. Not quietly. It's literally just rust and a missing front end. What's the appeal? The man with the clipboard said something Mason couldn't hear. Amelia glanced over at Mason. Direct, assessing, brief. Is this a sleeper? She asked him, with a tone that wasn't quite mocking but was close enough to its neighborhood to make the people nearby smile. I think it might be something interesting, Mason said. Something interesting, she repeated. Right, for $13,000. For $13,000. She looked at the car one more time, shook her head slightly. It's your money, she said, and walked away. The auctioneer cleared his throat. 13,000 going once, going twice. 11,5, Mason said. He'd heard himself say it before he'd decided to, a reflex from years of negotiating parts prices, the automatic pull toward the number that felt right. Everyone looked at him. I'm sorry, the auctioneer said. I want to revise my bid down to 11,5. a confused murmur. The auctioneer looked at his supervisor, who looked at the catalog, who looked at Mason. "Sir, you can't—" "I know, I'm sorry. 11.5 was what I meant to say. 13 was a mistake." He kept his voice perfectly even. Not apologetic, not aggressive, just matter of fact. It was a calculated risk. In most auctions, you could not simply lower a bid. But in the chaos of confusion, in the brief hesitation while everyone was trying to figure out what the rule actually was, 12, said the woman from across the room, who had apparently decided to take another run at it. There we go. 12.5, Mason said immediately. 12.5 once, the auctioneer said, now moving quickly as if to prevent any further procedural chaos. 12.5 twice. 13, said the woman. Annoyed now. Mason bid. She bid. He bid again. At $11,500, which he reached by a deliberate step down, he paused for 4 seconds that felt much longer, and she apparently decided this was too much trouble for something this ugly, and she dropped out. 11.5 going once, 11.5 going twice. The hammer came down. Sold for $11,500 to bidder. He checked the paddle number. 44. A handful of people near Mason smiled at the smallness of it, the pittance of it, the sight of a man in work boots paying 11 grand for a pile of rust that nobody else wanted. He heard laughter. He couldn't identify who it came from. It didn't matter. He stood there with his paddle and his empty water glass and the knowledge that was sitting in his chest like a coal with a lit edge, and he waited for the auction to finish so he could arrange transport for his car. His car. $11,500. The thought of what it might actually be worth was so large that he pushed it back down before it could make him do something ridiculous, like smile in a room full of people who were still laughing. The drive back to Brooklyn took 45 minutes longer than it should have because of an accident on the BQE. Mason sat in traffic with the radio off, his hands on the wheel, running through everything he knew. His father's files on Project Spectre occupied most of one drawer in the filing cabinet. Robert Brooks had spent 5 years accumulating information about it before his health started declining, and he'd shifted his focus to other things. The file was thin by his standards. A dozen pages of notes, some photocopied correspondence, the black and white photographs, and a long handwritten analysis at the back that his father had titled simply Working Theory. The car, according to Robert's research, had been commissioned in 1958 by a private racing consortium operating under a shell company called Meridian Motorsports. Their goal was a prototype purpose-built for a new endurance format, not Le Mans, but a proposed American equivalent that had been in discussion among the motorsport establishment for most of the mid-1950s. The race never happened. The consortium fell apart by 1960 due to infighting and financial problems, and the prototype, which had never been officially named, referred to in internal documents only as the Meridian S1, had been listed as destroyed in a fire at a storage facility in upstate New York in 1962. Official documentation showed it destroyed. Insurance paid on it, and that should have been the end of the story. Except Robert Brooks had a letter. One letter, obtained from the estate of a deceased racing official in 1987, that said otherwise. The letter was addressed to the official personally and was signed only with initials. It said, in part, that the destruction had been arranged to satisfy creditors and avoid legal complications, and that the car had actually been moved to a private property in Dutchess County, where it had remained. Robert had never been able to verify it. He died with the folder labeled unverified. Mason picked up Emma from after-school care at 5:30. She came out carrying a drawing of a horse that she'd done in class, and she climbed into the truck and immediately launched into a detailed account of what Tyler had done with someone else's lunch, which took them most of the way home. At dinner, she asked, "Did you find Grandpa's thing?" Mason looked at his plate for a moment. "Maybe," he said. "I need to look more carefully." "Was it worth buying?" "I hope so." "How much did you spend?" "A little more than $11,000. Emma processed this with the seriousness it deserved. "That's a lot." "Yeah." "Is it okay?" He looked at her. She was watching him with those eyes, Carla's eyes, patient and direct. "It's okay," he said. "Trust me." "I trust you," she said, matter-of-factly, and went back to her food. He sat with that for a moment before going back to his own. The transporter delivered the car to his garage 2 days later, on a Thursday afternoon. Mason had cleared space by moving 3 vehicles he was actively working on out to the curb with notes on them for their owners, which required 3 phone calls of explanation that he kept as brief as possible. The car came off the trailer and sat on his garage floor under the fluorescent lights and looked, if anything, worse than it had at the auction. In the clean light of a working space, the damage was more visible, not just surface rust, but structural rust in places, panel gaps that had grown over decades of thermal cycling, the kind of comprehensive neglect that happens when something sits undisturbed for 30 or 40 years in a space that was never heated or cooled. Mason stood in front of it for a while, just looking. Then he put Emma to bed, came back downstairs, put on a playlist his father used to play in the garage. Old country, nothing trendy, Merle Haggard and Waylon Jennings and some stuff Mason didn't know the name of, and went to work. He didn't try to restore it. Not yet. Possibly not ever. What he was doing was something more careful: documentation, examination, building a case. He worked with a flashlight and a camera and a small probe tool in a notebook, going over every inch of the car systematically, moving from front to rear and then underneath and then into the cockpit. He found 6 things in that first night that mattered. The first was the stamp he'd already seen, the internal designation marker near the transmission tunnel. He photographed it from 4 angles and measured it with a caliper. The second was a weld pattern on the left side frame rail. His father's notes, sourced from the Ohio machinist, described a specific welding technique used by the Meridian fabrication team, a result of the lead fabricators' training in aircraft construction, which produced joints that were structurally different from standard automotive practice in a way that was identifiable by anyone who knew what to look for. The welds on this frame matched the description precisely. The third was a set of mounting points at the rear of the chassis that corresponded to a proprietary exhaust system described in Robert's files, a system that had never been used on any other vehicle. The fourth was a small brass tag, partially hidden behind a bundle of old wiring, stamped with a number that matched a component number his father had listed in the unverified folder as having been ordered specifically for the S1 project. Mason sat very still for a full minute after finding that one. The fifth was the shape of the cockpit surround, the specific geometry of how the roll protection had been integrated into the body structure, which was described in a second-hand account from a journalist who had been briefly shown the car in 1959 before the project went private. The sixth was the most personal. In the stripped bare cockpit, in the channel where the driver's seat had once mounted, there was a small piece of masking tape, ancient, dried, nearly transparent, with handwriting on it so faded it was almost illegible. He photographed it, took the photograph to the computer upstairs, and enhanced it until he could read it. It was a name, a nickname probably, just Decker, in block letters, faded to gray, adhered to the floor pan of a car that had supposedly burned in 1962. He went to his father's folder. In the handwritten analysis at the back, Robert had named the driver who had been assigned to development testing on the S1 before the project was canceled, Roy Deckerman. Mason put the folder down. He went to the kitchen and stood at the window, and the city was doing its thing outside, indifferent and continuous, and he pressed his hands flat on the counter and breathed. Then he went back to the garage. He worked until 3 in the morning. He cataloged everything. He cross-referenced everything against the files. He took 340 photographs. At 3 o'clock, he sat down on the shop stool and looked at the car and thought about his father, Robert Brooks, who had spent 30 years on this and never found what he was looking for, who had died 4 years ago with the folder labeled unverified, who had told Mason once, only once, over beers on a summer evening when he'd had a few and was talking more freely than usual, "I think it's still out there. I think somebody hid it and it's sitting in a barn or a warehouse and they've forgotten it's there, or they died and didn't tell anyone. And someday someone's going to find it and they're not going to know what they're looking at. And that'll be the real crime. Not that it was hidden, but that it got found by the wrong person." He sat with that for a while. Then he picked up his notebook and started writing down the name of every automotive historian he knew. He reached out to Professor Henry Wallace on a Friday via email with the subject line, "Inquiry regarding possible Meridian Motorsports prototype." He kept it short. He described what he had, not with excitement, but with precision, the way his father would have. He attached 6 photographs, chosen specifically: the stamp, the weld detail, the brass tag, the mounting points, and 2 overall views. He sent it at 7:15 in the morning between dropping Emma at school and opening the garage. The response came at 11:48 that same day. Mr. Brooks, I don't say this often, so please understand the weight of it. You have my full attention. When can we speak? Professor Henry Wallace was 71 years old and had written 4 books on American motorsport history, the second of which had a chapter on Meridian Motorsports and the S1 project. Mason had read that chapter 17 times. He'd read it again 3 nights ago after finding the car. They talked for 90 minutes. Mason kept the photos open on his laptop and walked Wallace through each one methodically. Wallace asked questions that were specific and technical and occasionally interrupted himself mid-sentence to say something like, "Wait, go back. The weld pattern on the frame rail, is it a full penetration joint or—" And Mason would describe it, and Wallace would go quiet for a moment and then say, "Okay," in a voice that contained more than one thing. At the end of the call, Wallace said, "I need to see it in person." "I know," Mason said. "That's why I called you." "Mason," a pause. "If this is what you think it is, I know. The ramifications for the collector market alone. I know, Professor." Another pause. "You should be careful who you talk to about this." "I understand." "No, I don't think you do." Wallace's voice had changed slightly, quieter, more deliberate. "I've been in this field for 40 years. When something like this surfaces, certain people find out about it very quickly, and some of those people are not the kind of people who care about history or preservation. They care about possession. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Mason looked at the car, at the brass tag, at the faded name on the strip of masking tape. "Yeah," he said. "I understand. I can be in Brooklyn on Tuesday." "Tuesday works," Mason said. "I'll have coffee." He hung up and stood in the garage for a moment, just him and the car and Waylon Jennings coming out of the old Bluetooth speaker he'd had since before Emma was born. He thought about the folder marked Unverified. He thought about his father standing in the hospital hallway with his arms crossed, jaw tight. He thought about Emma saying, "Grandpa was usually right." "Yeah, Dad," he said, to no one in particular. "You were right." The car sat there, rust-eaten and broken and improbable, under the fluorescent light of a Brooklyn garage, waiting, like it had been waiting for 60 years, for someone who knew how to look. Tuesday arrived the way important days sometimes do, quietly, without announcement, looking exactly like any other morning. Mason was up at 5 again, not because the alarm forced him, but because sleep had become increasingly theoretical over the past 4 days. He'd been in the garage until past midnight every night since the call with Wallace, not working on the car directly, but sitting with it, reading through his father's files again, cross-referencing details he'd already cross-referenced twice. There was something compulsive about it that he recognized and couldn't stop. Like checking that the stove is off. Like checking again. Like checking a third time because your brain doesn't trust the answer. Emma came downstairs at 6:15 and found him at the kitchen table with 3 folders spread out in a coffee mug that had gone cold an hour earlier. "You look tired," she said. "I'm fine." Mrs. Okafor says that when people say they're fine really fast, it usually means they're not fine. Mrs. Okafor is very wise. He closed the folder on top. "What do you want for breakfast?" "Eggs." "And can I see the car today?" He looked at her. She was still in her pajamas, the ones with the small horses on them. She'd found them in a drawer and hadn't taken them off willingly since. Her hair was loose and tangled on one side from sleeping. "A man is coming to look at it today," Mason said. "An expert. It's going to be kind of serious." "I won't bother anyone," Emma said, with the dignity of someone who has been told this before and finds it unnecessary. "I know you won't." "So can I see it?" He made eggs. He let her see the car. She stood in the garage doorway in her horse pajamas and looked at the Meridian S1 the way children look at things that adults have told them are important, with a specific combination of respect and honest disappointment. It was, objectively, not impressive to look at. Not to a 6-year-old who had been hoping for something that looked at least somewhat like the race cars she'd seen on television. "It's kind of ugly," she said. "Yeah," Mason agreed. "Right now it is. But it's worth a lot?" "Maybe. If it's what I think it is." She nodded slowly. Then she walked over to it carefully and reached out and touched the hood. Just her fingertips, lightly, on the rusted metal. She pulled her hand back and looked at the reddish dust on her fingertips. "Grandpa never found it," she said. It wasn't a question. "No, he didn't." "But you did." "Maybe," Mason said again, but this time the word felt different, smaller, more like a formality than an actual uncertainty. Emma wiped her fingers on her pajama pants and went back inside to get ready for school. Mason stood in the garage alone with the car and the morning light and the particular silence of a space where something irreversible might be about to happen. Professor Henry Wallace arrived at 11:17, which was 17 minutes late because his cab had taken a wrong turn, and he refused, on principle, to use the navigation app on his phone. He was a tall man, slightly stooped at the shoulders in the way of people who have spent a lifetime leaning over documents and photographs and engine bays. He had white hair, thick and slightly unkempt, and he was wearing a corduroy jacket with a pen clipped to the breast pocket that had leaked at some point, leaving a small dark stain that he either hadn't noticed or had decided wasn't worth addressing. He stood in the doorway of Mason's garage and looked at the car for a long moment without speaking. "Well?" he said finally. "Yeah," Mason said. "May I?" "Go ahead." Wallace set down his bag, a battered leather satchel that looked like it had been on several continents, and walked toward the car. He moved around it slowly, hands clasped behind his back, in a way that reminded Mason uncomfortably of how Amelia Sterling had moved around it at the auction. The similarity stopped there. Where Amelia had been looking for a reason to dismiss it, Wallace was looking for a reason to believe it, and the difference between those two kinds of looking was enormous. He crouched at the front. He moved to the side. He got onto his hands and knees on Mason's garage floor without any apparent concern for his corduroy jacket and looked at the undercarriage. He asked for a flashlight. He asked for the photographs Mason had taken, which Mason had printed and put in a folder. He sat on the shop stool and went through them one at a time, very slowly, occasionally holding one up next to what he was looking at on the car. He didn't speak for 40 minutes. Mason made fresh coffee, brought him a mug, and stayed out of the way. He knew better than to rush it. His father had taught him that too. Don't push an expert while they're working. You'll get a worse answer faster, and a worse answer is worth nothing. When Wallace finally stood up, his knees cracked loudly, and he winced and put one hand on the car's hood to steady himself. He looked at Mason. "The stamp," he said. "Yeah." "The weld pattern on the frame rail." "Yeah." "The brass tag." He paused. "I need you to tell me where you found the brass tag exactly." Mason told him. Exactly. The location, the orientation, the partial obscurement behind the wiring bundle. Wallace listened without expression. "And the tape," Wallace said, "in the cockpit." "It's still there. I didn't disturb it." Wallace turned back to the car. He looked at it in silence for another moment, not examining it now, just looking at it the way you look at something when you're trying to reconcile what you thought was true with what is apparently in front of you. "I wrote about this car," he said, "in 2003, chapter 7 of the second book. I said, and I quote from my own text because it haunts me, that the probability of the S1 surviving the 1962 fire was essentially nil, supported by insurance documentation and the account of 3 independent witnesses." He picked up his coffee mug. "I was quite confident." "You didn't have everything my father had," Mason said. "It wasn't defensive, just factual. Your father, Robert Brooks." Wallace said the name carefully. "I didn't know him personally, but I knew of him. He corresponded with at least 2 people in my circle over the years. He was considered somewhat, the polite word is unconventional, in his approach." "He was stubborn," Mason said. "He believed what he believed, and he didn't let go of it." "Clearly." Wallace set the mug down. "Mason, I need to say something carefully, so please hear the careful part and not just the headline." "Okay." "The evidence you have collected here is extraordinarily compelling. Every physical marker that should be present on an authentic Meridian S1 prototype is present here. The stamp, the welds, the tag, the component geometry, the cockpit configuration. In 40 years of examining American race cars, I have never seen a more coherent assembly of provenance markers on a single vehicle." He stopped. "However." "I know," Mason said. However, this is also, theoretically, the most elaborate and precisely executed forgery I've ever encountered. Someone who had access to Robert Brooks's research, or to the original machinist's accounts, or to the archive from the racing official's estate. It's not a forgery, Mason said. Not angrily. Quietly. Wallace looked at him. I know it's not, Mason said. I grew up with my father's research. I know what it says and what it doesn't say. This car has things on it that aren't in any of his notes. Details that match the story, but that he never documented because he didn't know them. The wiring harness routing, the way the firewall is braced. These aren't things anyone could have forged from his files because his files don't have them. He paused. It's not a forgery. It's the car. Wallace held his gaze for a long moment. I know, the professor said quietly. I know it's the car. I just needed to say the other thing first. They looked at each other across the hood of the most valuable automobile either of them had ever stood next to. So, Mason said, what do we do? First, Wallace said, we do this properly. Metallurgical analysis of the frame materials, spectrographic dating of the paint layers, component provenance on the brass tag. I know a man at the National Automotive Museum who has the original purchasing records from 3 of the major suppliers Meridian used. Full documentation. This takes time, and it costs money, and it has to be done correctly, because the moment this becomes public, there will be people who challenge it. How long? If everything moves quickly? 8 weeks, possibly 10. Mason nodded. He could manage 10 weeks. He'd been managing the last 4 years on a budget that left very little margin, and he could manage 10 more weeks. And then, he said. And then, Wallace said, picking up his satchel, we figure out what you want to do with it, which is a question worth thinking about very carefully. He paused in the doorway. Your father spent 30 years on this. Have you thought about what he would have wanted done with it? Mason hadn't quite. Not in those terms. He would have wanted it in a museum, Mason said after a moment. Someplace people could see it. And you? He looked at the car. I want it to be what it is, he said, whatever that costs. Wallace nodded, seeming to find this acceptable, and left. The garage was quiet. Mason stood there for a while, then picked up the cold coffee mug Wallace had left and took it back to the kitchen sink. Through the window, he could see the street, ordinary and continuous. A delivery driver double-parked. 2 kids on bikes arguing about something. A woman walking fast with earbuds in, not looking at anything around her. He thought about the folder marked unverified. He thought about it sitting in the filing cabinet for 4 years since his father died, waiting. He rinsed the mug and went back to work. The first call from Victor Kane came 9 days later, on a Thursday afternoon, while Mason was torquing cylinder head bolts on a customer's Jeep Grand Cherokee. He didn't recognize the number, so he let it go to voicemail, and then listened to it later with grease still on his hands. The voice was smooth and measured, the kind of voice that had been trained by years of conversations where money was the subject, and the speaker's goal was to never sound like money was the subject. Mr. Brooks, my name is Victor Kane. I'm an independent collector and dealer in rare and significant automobiles. I understand you recently acquired an interesting vehicle at the Sterling auction. I'd love to have a conversation, purely exploratory, at your convenience. A phone number. A pause. I hope you'll call me back. Mason listened to it twice. Then he put his phone in his pocket and went back to the Jeep. He did not call Victor Kane back. The second call came the following Monday. Same number, different message. Slightly warmer this time, slightly more familiar in tone, as if they had already spoken and this was a follow-up. Mason, hi, Victor Kane again. I don't want to be a pest, but I've heard some things through the collector community that have piqued my interest in your acquisition. I think we might have a conversation that's beneficial to both parties. I can make it worth your while just to meet. He listened to it and thought, who told him? He thought about this for the better part of an afternoon. The auction itself was public. Anyone who'd been in the room that day could have talked. The staff could have talked. But what Kane seemed to know, from the phrase, I've heard some things through the collector community, was more than just that someone had bought an ugly car for $11,000. He knew something about what the car might be. That meant someone who knew more than the auction basics. That meant someone in Wallace's orbit, or someone adjacent to it, or someone who had simply been paying attention to the right conversations in the right circles. This was what Wallace had warned him about. Certain people find out very quickly. He didn't call Kane back. The third call came on a Wednesday, and this time when Mason's phone buzzed, he looked at the number and picked up. Mr. Brooks. The voice was exactly what the voicemails had promised. Smooth, unhurried, comfortable with silence. I'm glad you answered. What do you want? Mason said. He was in the garage. The S1 was under its canvas cover in the corner. He'd taken to covering it when he wasn't actively working on the documentation. A small pause. Just long enough to register the directness and decide how to respond to it. I want to have a straightforward conversation. I think you found something significant, and I think I can help you understand what it's worth. I have a pretty good idea what it's worth, Mason said. Do you? The tone didn't change, but something beneath it shifted slightly. Because vehicles like this, assuming it's what people in the community are suggesting, are complicated propositions. The authentication process is expensive and time-consuming. The legal landscape around provenance claims on vehicles with disputed histories is complex. There are aspects of bringing something like this to market that require expertise and relationships that take decades to build. I've got good people, Mason said. You have Henry Wallace, Kane said. Henry is a fine historian. He's not a dealer. He's not a negotiator. He's never sold a significant vehicle in his life. Another pause, gentler this time, almost sympathetic. I have. Many. I know the buyers. I know the auction houses. I know how to maximize the value of something extraordinary. And the offer I'm prepared to make, Mason. May I call you Mason? Mr. Brooks. A beat. The offer I'm prepared to make, Mr. Brooks, for the vehicle as is, unverified, is $2.4 million. Cash. No authentication required on your end. No waiting, no legal exposure, no complicated auction process. $2.4 million, and the car becomes my problem. Mason stood very still. $2.4 million was a number that could change everything. Pay off the garage. Pay off the apartment. Emma's education. A real house somewhere with a yard, a real yard, not the strip of concrete behind the building where she drew on the sidewalk with chalk. $2.4 million was a number that represented more money than Mason had ever expected to have in his life. He thought about his father's folder. No, he said. Silence on the other end, long enough that Mason wondered if the call had dropped. No, Kane said. No. Another pause. When Kane spoke again, the smoothness was still there, but it was doing more work now, covering something underneath it that was a little less comfortable. Can I ask why not? 2.4 is a very strong offer for a vehicle that isn't authenticated. Because it's worth $8 million, Mason said. Maybe more. And you know that, or you wouldn't be calling me. He paused. We're done. He hung up. He stood in the garage with his phone in his hand and his heart going at a speed that surprised him. His hands weren't shaking. He noticed that, made a point of noticing it. His hands were steady. He looked at the canvas-covered car. $8 million, he said out loud, testing the shape of it. It still didn't feel real. It felt like a number from someone else's life, which, 4 weeks ago, it had been. He pulled out his phone and called Wallace. Victor Kane called me, he said when Wallace picked up. A short silence. When? Just now. He offered 2.4. You said no. I said no. Good. Wallace's voice was careful, controlled, but not quite controlled enough to hide the undercurrent of relief. Mason, I should have warned you more specifically. Kane he's effective at what he does. He has a way of making offers that sound reasonable in the moment, especially to people who... He stopped. People who need money, Mason said. People who aren't used to these amounts, Wallace said, choosing his words with more care. He's done it before. Acquired significant vehicles at a fraction of their value because the owners didn't know what they had, or knew but couldn't wait out the process. Can't force me to sell. No. But he can make the process very uncomfortable. He has lawyers. He has people who know how to generate questions about provenance, cast doubt on authenticity claims, slow things down. He's done that too. Wallace paused. I'm accelerating the timeline on the technical analysis. I've called in a favor with the metallurgy lab. We can have preliminary results in 3 weeks instead of 6. And I'm flying to Michigan next week to see the purchasing records in person. Thank you, Mason said. Don't thank me yet, Wallace said. Keep the car covered. Don't talk about it to anyone you haven't already talked to. And if Kane contacts you again, don't answer. Mason agreed, hung up, and stood in the garage until his heartbeat settled back to something approaching normal. Then he went upstairs to start dinner before Emma got home. She came through the door at 5:40 with a permission slip for a field trip that needed to be signed and a very serious opinion about what she wanted for dinner, which was pasta, specifically the kind with the cheese that went all the way to the edges of the bowl. And Mason made it because it was the easiest thing in the world to give her, and some days you needed to be able to do that. After she was in bed, he went back to the garage and sat with the car and his father's files for 2 hours. And he didn't find up on anything new because he'd already found everything there was to find. He just needed to sit with it. The lawyers arrived, or rather, the letter arrived, the following Friday. It was from a firm called Hargrove, Pell & Associates, 12 pages, dense with language that had been specifically engineered to seem both comprehensive and incomprehensible. The core of it, once Mason had read it 3 times and identified the actual claims beneath the legal architecture, was this. A client of Hargrove, Pell, unnamed, claimed to have prior ownership interest in a vehicle matching the description of the one Mason had purchased at the Sterling auction based on a chain of title that the letter declined to specify in any detail but promised to produce upon agreement to enter formal negotiation. It was not a lawsuit, not yet. It was something worse. A document designed to make the threat of a lawsuit feel so solid and expensive and inevitable that the cheaper path was simply to sell and be done with it. Mason read it again. Then he called the only lawyer he actually knew, which was a woman named Patricia Gomes, who had helped him with the Garages Incorporation 3 years ago, and who operated out of a small office in Park Slope and had the particular energy of someone who went into law specifically to argue with people who thought their money made them correct. "Read me the claim," she said. He read it. "That's thin," she said. "That is extremely thin. They're hoping you don't know it's thin." I figured. "Who sent it?" "A firm called Hargrove, Pell." A pause. "Kane," she said. "You know them?" "I know of them. They do a lot of work for high net worth collectors when those collectors want to intimidate smaller parties into walking away from something valuable." Her voice was very level. "This is designed to scare you." "It's working a little," Mason admitted. "Good," Patricia said. "Scared is fine. Scared and informed is better than falsely confident. Can you send me the full letter?" He photographed all 12 pages and emailed them from the shop computer. "Give me 48 hours, she said. "Don't respond to anything before we talk." He didn't respond to anything. He opened the garage on Monday, took in 3 cars, did 3 oil changes and a brake job and a cooling system flush, talked to 4 customers, called 2 suppliers about parts that were taking too long to arrive, ate a sandwich over the work sink at 1:15, picked Emma up from school at 3:30, listened to her describe a conflict of profound complexity regarding who was first in line for the classroom. Rabbit, made tacos for dinner, helped with homework that involved identifying shapes, and went to bed at 10:30 with his father's handwritten analysis sitting on the nightstand. He read the last paragraph before he turned off the light. Whatever it is we think we're searching for, what we're really doing is keeping faith with the thing we believe in. The car may or may not exist. The evidence may or may not hold together, but the act of looking, of refusing to accept that something valuable has simply vanished from the world without a trace, that's not delusion. That's the most human thing I know how to do. I'd rather be wrong and still looking than right, and have stopped. He turned off the light. In the dark, he thought about the 2.4 million. He thought about it honestly, the way you think about temptation when no one is watching. Not with contempt for it, not with easy resistance, but with a clear-eyed acknowledgement of what it would mean. Emma's school. The mortgage on the garage, his shoulder, which needed surgery he'd been putting off for 2 years because he couldn't afford the downtime. Then he thought about the brass tag, the weld pattern, the masking tape with Roy Deckerman's nickname on it, pressed against the floor pan of a car that had been supposed to be ash for 60 years. He thought about what his father said, the most human thing I know how to do. He wasn't selling. The preliminary metallurgical results came in 22 days after the legal letter, which was 1 day faster than Wallace had promised. Mason got the call in the morning between the second and third customer of the day. He stepped out of the garage into the thin October sunlight with oil on his hands and his phone pressed to his ear. The alloy composition of the frame rails, Wallace said without preamble, is consistent with aircraft-grade chromoly steel produced in the late 1950s by a foundry in Pittsburgh that ceased operation in 1964. Current reproduction of that specific alloy would require custom milling. The probability that it was fabricated after 1970 is, according to the lab, essentially zero. A pause. The paint layers corroborate. Oldest stratum dates to 1958 to 1960. No modern compounds. Mason sat down on the front bumper of a customer's Volvo. "Mason," Wallace said, "it's real." "I know," Mason said. "I know you know," Wallace said. "But now we have paper. Now we have science. Now nobody can stand in front of a room full of people and say the word forgery without looking extremely foolish." His voice was doing the thing where it was working hard to stay measured. "I've been in this field for 40 years. I have never—" He stopped. Started again. "Roy Deckerman died in 1991. His daughter is still living in Arizona. I've been in contact with her. She remembers her father talking about the car. She has letters, personal letters he wrote in the 1960s that she has never shown anyone." "Ibem chipom tom almaseni." Mason's throat tightened. "She said," Wallace continued, and his voice had gone quiet now, the academic precision giving way to something underneath it. "She said her father always believed someone would find it eventually. He said the car was too important to stay lost forever." Neither of them said anything for a moment. A cab honked somewhere on the block. A pigeon landed on the Volvo's hood and looked at Mason and left. "What's next?" Mason said. "I'm calling the auction house this afternoon, the one with the capacity for something of this significance. We need to establish provenance documentation, get the legal claim sorted. Your attorney?" "Working on it." "Good." "And Mason," Wallace paused, "whatever happens from here on, whatever the final number is, whatever the auction result, I want you to know that your father was right. He was right. And he spent 30 years being right in a room full of people who thought he wasn't, and that deserves to be said plainly." Mason looked at the garage, at the ordinary Brooklyn street, at the small sign above the door that said Brooks Auto in letters that had faded from dark green to something closer to gray. "Yeah," he said, "it does." He went back to work. He had 3 more cars to get through before the end of the day, and Emma needed new sneakers. And the cooling system flush he'd done that morning had left a stain on the floor he needed to clean before it set. The world was still exactly what it had always been. Specific, demanding, indifferent to the size of the thing sitting under a canvas cover in the corner of his garage. He picked up his wrench. Outside, somewhere in the collector world, phones were beginning to ring. The phones that had started ringing in the collector world rang faster in the week that followed Wallace's call. And by the end of that week, Mason was getting messages from numbers he didn't recognize on platforms he barely used. Someone had found his shop's Instagram account, which he'd set up 3 years ago and updated maybe 6 times, mostly photos of engine work that Emma had insisted looked cool. And the follower count had gone from 340 to somewhere north of 4,000 in 72 hours. He didn't know how that happened. He didn't fully understand how these things spread. The specific mechanics of information moving through a community of people who were passionate and well-connected and had a lot of time to spend online talking about cars. He just knew that the quiet he'd been counting on was gone. He turned off the notifications on his phone and called Patricia. "The legal claim," she said before he could ask. "I've been waiting to call you until I had something definitive. The chain of title they're asserting is based on a private sale document from 1971. A bill of sale claiming the S1 was sold by a shell company called Meridian Consolidated to a private individual named Harold Vess for $400. $400, Mason said. $400. In 1971. For what they're now claiming is an $8 million prototype. She let that sit for a moment. The document has problems. The notarization is from a county in Ohio that didn't have a notary with that license number in 1971. The shell company, Meridian Consolidated, was dissolved in 1964, 7 years before this supposed sale, and Harold Vess, the alleged buyer, died in 1969. So it's fabricated. It's fabricated so badly that I genuinely wonder if it was intended as a threat, rather than an actual legal argument, something to make you nervous and spend money responding to without them having to win in court. Her voice had that particular quality it got when she was explaining something she found personally offensive. I'm preparing a formal response. It'll go out by end of week. After that, if they push further, they're doing it knowing we know it's garbage, which changes the calculus considerably. Mason exhaled. Thank you, Patricia. Thank me when it's resolved, she said. And Mason, get better locks on the garage. He got better locks on the garage. He also got a camera system, the kind that covered 3 angles and fed to his phone, which he set up on a Sunday afternoon while Emma sat on an overturned bucket and handed him zip ties and asked questions he answered as honestly as he could without alarming her. She was a child who responded better to information than to vague reassurances, which he'd learned the hard way in the months after Carla died, when he'd tried to protect her from the specifics, and she'd filled the gaps with things that were worse. Why do we need cameras? She asked. Because the car is worth a lot, and some people know about it now, and I want to make sure it's safe. Are people going to try to take it? I don't know, maybe. I want to be ready in case. She considered this. Like how you lock the truck even in front of our house? Exactly like that. Okay, she said, and handed him another zip tie. Victor Kane did not go away. He didn't call again directly. Patricia's letter had apparently persuaded him that direct contact was no longer strategically useful. But his presence in the situation was felt through other means, the way weather is felt before it arrives. A collector Mason had never met sent him a long email explaining that Kane was a trustworthy partner in complicated situations, and that Mason should seriously reconsider the offer on the table. 2 days later, a reporter from a small automotive enthusiast publication contacted the garage asking for comment on the controversy surrounding a recently discovered race car in Brooklyn. Mason didn't call back. He forwarded the email to Patricia. Then, on a Thursday evening, a black car parked in front of the garage and sat there for 2 hours without anyone getting out of it. Mason noticed it at 6:15 when he was closing up. He watched it from the window of the apartment upstairs. At 8:30 it left. He couldn't see the plates from that angle, and the camera angle on that side of the building caught the rear of the car, but not the plate clearly enough to read. He sat at the kitchen table for a while after Emma was in bed, with his laptop open and a cold cup of coffee beside it, and thought about what his father would have done. Robert Brooks had not been a particularly anxious man, but he'd been a practical one. He believed in doing the next concrete thing rather than sitting with the abstract threat. Mason called the non-emergency police line and reported the vehicle as suspicious, knowing it would probably go nowhere but establishing a record that it had happened. Then he called Wallace. "Someone sat outside my garage for 2 hours tonight," he said. A pause. "Are you and Emma safe?" "Yeah, they just sat there and left." "This is Kane's style," Wallace said, and his voice was tight in a way Mason hadn't heard before. "He doesn't do anything illegal. He just makes the temperature uncomfortable until people decide it's easier to sell." "It's not going to work," Mason said. "I know." A pause. "I know that, Mason. I just want you to know that the auction house is moving. We have a date, tentatively, 6 weeks out. Once we have an official date and the car is in their custody, Kane's leverage essentially disappears. They have security, they have lawyers, they have the infrastructure for this." 6 weeks, Mason repeated. "Can you hold 6 weeks?" He thought about the camera feeds on his phone, the new locks, Emma handing him zip ties, Patricia's letter, the lab report with its precise, devastating language about chromoly steel and paint stratigraphy. "Yeah," he said. 6 weeks is fine." He wasn't entirely sure that was true, but he said it like it was. The situation changed 9 days later on a Wednesday, and the change came from a direction Mason hadn't anticipated. He was under a Honda Accord replacing a CV axle when he heard footsteps stop near the garage entrance. He slid out from under the car and found himself looking at Amelia Sterling. She was wearing jeans and a dark coat, no blazer, no clipboard-carrying assistant. Her hair was down this time, and she looked not exactly different from the auction, but like a different version of the same person, the way people sometimes look when they're not in the context you met them in. She was standing at the edge of his garage with her hands in her pockets, an expression on her face that was somewhere between composed and uncertain, and she looked, for the first time since he'd observed her, like someone who wasn't sure what kind of reception they were going to get. Mr. Brooks, she said. Mason stood up. He was holding a wrench and wearing a shirt that had seen better days, and his hair was doing whatever it wanted, which was its default state. He was aware of the gap between what he looked like and what she looked like, and then he was aware of being aware of it, which he found briefly annoying. "Miss Sterling," he said. A short silence. She looked around the garage with what seemed like genuine attention, not the performative interest of someone trying to seem down to earth, but actual observation. She looked at the lifts, the tool organization on the pegboard, the car on the hoist beside them. She looked at the corner where the S1 sat under its canvas cover. "I owe you an apology," she said. He didn't help her with it, didn't say, "Oh, it's fine," or "Don't worry about it." The reflexive deflections that make apologies easier for the person delivering them. He just waited. She seemed to recognize this, and something in her expression shifted slightly. Not offense, just a recalibration. "What I said at the auction, about it being a wreck, about—" She stopped, started again. "I said it publicly, in front of people. I said it in a way that was designed to be dismissive, that was about performing confidence, not about actually knowing what I was looking at. And I didn't know what I was looking at." "No," Mason said. "You didn't." She looked at him directly. "How did you know?" It was a real question, not small talk, not social lubrication. She actually wanted to know. He pulled the shop stool out from under the workbench and sat down because his back was sore, and this was his garage. He didn't offer her a seat, but there was a folding chair leaning against the wall, and she saw it, and opened it herself and sat down. "My father spent 30 years researching that car," Mason said, "or what he thought might be that car. He never found it. He died 4 years ago, still thinking about it." He paused. "I grew up with his research. I knew what to look for before I knew why I was looking." "How old were you when he started telling you about it?" "I don't know, 7, 8. He used to talk about it the way some dads talk about baseball. It was just always there, part of the furniture." Amelia was quiet for a moment. "My father was like that about his work," she said, and then seemed slightly surprised that she'd said it. "Not cars, software systems. He could talk about architecture patterns for 3 hours and never notice anyone had stopped listening." A pause. "I learned to listen, or to look like I was listening." "You learned to run companies," Mason said. "I learned to run companies," she agreed, "which is a different skill set than knowing what you're looking at in an auction room." She glanced at the canvas-covered car. "I've been reading about it, the Meridian S1, since it became clear what you'd found." "What have you read?" "Wallace's book, mostly. The chapter on Meridian, and some archived material from a motorsport journal from 1959 that had a brief mention of a private prototype project." She paused. "I understand it now. What it is. What it means." She looked at him. "I still can't quite believe I stood in front of it and called it a wreck." "You weren't wrong about what it looked like," Mason said. "I was wrong about what it was." "Yeah," he said. "You were." Another silence. It wasn't uncomfortable, exactly. It had the specific quality of a silence between two people who are both trying to be honest and are discovering that honesty takes up a certain amount of space. "I also want to say," Amelia said, "and this is partly why I came in person rather than sending a message. I became aware that Victor Kane has been creating difficulties for you." Mason was still. "I know Victor," she said. "He's been in my professional orbit for years. He operates in a gray area that I've always found, I've overlooked it, is the truthful way to say that, because he's useful to know, and he's never created problems for me specifically." She stopped. "When I heard what he was doing, the legal letter, the car parked outside, how do you know about that?" "Because I ask questions," she said plainly. "I have resources and I use them. I want to be honest about that. I wasn't entitled to that information and I gathered it anyway, so I'm telling you." She held his gaze. "I called Victor yesterday." Mason said nothing. "I told him to stop," Amelia said. "I told him that I had a direct interest in this situation as the auction house that sold you the vehicle, and that any legal action related to the chain of title of that vehicle would require my cooperation, which he would not be getting." She paused. "I may have also told him that if he continued creating problems for you, I would make certain conversations about his business practices available to certain journalists who have been trying to have them for some time. The garage was quiet. Through the open door, a truck went past on the street. "Did it work?" Mason said. "He told me it was all a misunderstanding and that he'd already withdrawn the legal claim." She said it without satisfaction, just reported it like a fact. "I'd verify that with your attorney." He'd call Patricia in the morning. "Why?" he said. Amelia looked at him for a moment. Not calculating the answer, she seemed to already have it. "Because I was wrong in that auction room, about the car, about you, about what it means to look at something and decide it has no value before you've actually looked." She paused. "And because Victor Kane has been doing this for years, to people with less ability to push back than you, and I've been in a position to say something about it for a long time, and I haven't." Mason turned the wrench over in his hands. It was an old one, his father's actually, a 3/8 drive that had lived in the Brooks garage since before Mason was born. The handle was worn smooth in the grip. "I'm not going to thank you," he said, "because this is... Kane's claim was garbage, Patricia was going to handle it, and if you hadn't done anything, I'd still be standing here in 6 weeks when the auction happens." "I know," Amelia said, "but I appreciate that you came in person." She nodded. She stood up and folded the chair and leaned it back against the wall. And this small domestic act, folding the chair, putting it back, landed differently than everything else she'd said or done, somehow. It made her more legible. "One more thing," she said at the edge of the garage. "My auction house. I know you're working with another house for the sale. I'm not here to try to take that from you, but if there's ever anything I can do, from an administrative or logistical standpoint, my people are available." She paused. "Consider it a correction." She left. Mason sat in his garage for a while, turning the wrench in his hands. He thought about what she'd said. "I've overlooked it," is the truthful way to say that. He'd expected, if she ever showed up, defensiveness or calculation, or the particular variety of apology that's actually an explanation. He hadn't expected someone to walk into his garage with their hands in their pockets and say the thing plainly, and then put the chair back. He called Patricia and left a voicemail about the Kane claim. Then he went upstairs. Emma was still awake, which she wasn't supposed to be, sitting in bed with a horse book open on her lap and looking not even slightly guilty about it. "You should be asleep," Mason said. "I was reading." Reading counts as not sleeping. She considered disputing this, but seemed to decide against it. "Who was that lady?" "What lady?" "The one in the garage. I saw her from the window." He'd forgotten about the window. He leaned in the doorway. "She's the woman who ran the auction where I bought the car." "The one who laughed?" He blinked. He hadn't told Emma that. "How do you know about that?" Emma looked at him with the particular patience of a child who finds adult obtuseness tiresome. "You said it on the phone to Professor Wallace. Your voice goes really loud when you're on the phone." "I'll work on that," Mason said. "And yeah, she's the one who laughed." What did she want? She wanted to apologize. Emma thought about this. Did she? Yeah, she did. Was it a good apology? Mason thought about Amelia Sterling standing at the edge of his garage with her hands in her pockets, and no entourage and no clipboard and no audience. Yeah, he said. It was pretty good. Emma nodded, satisfied, and closed her book. Okay, good night. Good night. He turned off her light and stood in the hallway for a moment in the dark. 3 weeks later, Wallace flew to Arizona. He told Mason about it in advance. A brief call, practical and specific. Diana Deckerman was 73 years old, Roy's daughter, and she'd been living in Tucson since her second marriage in the 1990s. She had a box of her father's things, including 6 letters he'd written to a racing colleague in the years between 1963 and 1971, in which he'd referred to the S1 obliquely, using language that only made sense now that the car had surfaced. Wallace called from Tucson on a Tuesday night while Mason was washing dishes. She's remarkable, he said. 73 years old and sharper than anyone I've spoken to in years. A pause. She cried when I showed her the photographs. Not dramatically. She just went quiet for a while and looked at them, and then she said, "He always said it would come back." Mason turned off the tap and stood at the sink. Roy Deckerman drove the S1 in 5 development sessions in 1959 and 1960, Wallace continued. According to Diana, he considered it the finest machine he'd ever sat in. He said it had something in the way it moved that he'd never experienced before or since, a responsiveness that was almost, his word, according to Diana, personal, like it knew what he was about to do. Mason thought about the masking tape, the faded nickname, Decker pressed against the floor pan in block letters, and Roy Deckerman knowing that car would outlast him by decades, that somewhere under the dust and the rust, it was still exactly what it had always been. The letters, Mason said. Are they enough? Combined with everything else we have? Yes, unambiguously. Wallace's voice was steady, but there was something just beneath it. The tone of a man who has spent 40 years looking for exactly this kind of completeness and is now holding it. Diana is willing to be publicly identified. She wants to be. She said, and I'm quoting her now, "My father deserves to be in the room when that car finds its place." Mason leaned against the kitchen counter. The city was outside doing what it always did. The camera feed on his phone showed the garage still, quiet, the canvas cover on the S1 unchanged. 6 weeks, Mason said. We said 6 weeks. It's going to happen, Wallace said. This is real, Mason. This is actually happening. He knew it was real. He'd known it was real since he'd lain on the concrete floor of the auction room and read those 2 letters and 3 numbers in the beam of his phone flashlight. But there was a difference between knowing it privately in the specific enclosed space of your own conviction and hearing Wallace say it out loud from a kitchen in Tucson after showing a 73-year-old woman photographs of her father's car. The difference felt like something finally exhaling. Thank you, Mason said, for all of it. Your father did the work, Wallace said simply. I just confirmed it. After he hung up, Mason went to the filing cabinet in the storage corner of the apartment, the one he'd brought from his father's house when Robert died. The one with the scratched metal and the sticky third drawer and the decades of methodical, cross-referenced, index-carded obsession inside it. He pulled open the drawer that held the Meridian files and took out the thin folder at the back. Project Spectre/Unverified. He held it for a moment. The folder was worn at the edges from years of being handled and replaced and handled again. His father's handwriting on the tab was faded, but still legible, that careful, cramped script that Mason had been reading his whole life. He thought about writing verified on the tab. He even got a pen out. Then he put the pen back down. He put the folder back in the drawer. He closed the filing cabinet. Some things didn't need to be changed. They just needed to be stood next to for long enough. He went to bed. The night before the car was scheduled to be transported to the auction house, a Thursday, unremarkable in every external detail, cold and clear in the way November sometimes is in New York, Mason put Emma to bed and then went down to the garage one last time. He didn't do anything in particular. He didn't examine the car or document anything or cross-reference anything. He just took the canvas cover off and stood there under the fluorescent lights looking at the Meridian S1 in the plain, honest light of a working garage, the way he'd looked at it the first time, the way he'd looked at it 100 times since. It still looked like what it looked like. The missing front fascia, the rust, the wrong wheel on the one corner, the decade sitting in a barn in Dutchess County while the world moved around it and forgot about it. None of that had changed, but the brass tag was there, the stamp was there, the welds were there, and somewhere in the stripped-out cockpit, on a strip of masking tape that had lasted 60 years against all reasonable expectation, Roy Deckerman's nickname was still pressed against the floor pan. Mason thought about his father reading the Ohio machinist's letter for the first time. Sitting at his kitchen table, probably, he always read important things at the kitchen table, going still in the way he went still when something mattered. Setting the letter down carefully. Getting up to make coffee, which was what he did when he needed to think. Standing at the kitchen window, which was what he did when the coffee didn't help. 30 years between that moment and this one. Mason put his hand on the hood of the car. The metal was cold and rough under his palm, and the rust came off on his skin, and he didn't wipe it away. I found it, Dad, he said quietly. Not for any effect, just because it was true and it deserved to be said out loud at least once, in the right place, before everything that came next. The garage was quiet. The camera feeds showed the street outside, empty and ordinary. Somewhere upstairs, Emma was asleep with her horse pajamas and her horse book and the absolute faith of a child who has decided that the person they love knows what they're doing. He stood there for a while. Then he put the canvas cover back on, turned off the lights, and went upstairs. Tomorrow the car would go to the auction house. Tomorrow, everything that had been private would become public. But tonight it was still his and his father's and Roy Deckerman's and whatever else had accumulated in 60 years of waiting. And he let himself have the full weight of it, the grief and the pride and the exhaustion and the thing that felt like completion but wasn't quite that simple. He thought about his father's last line. I'd rather be wrong and still looking than right, and have stopped. He hadn't stopped. Neither of them had. The transporter arrived at 7 in the morning, earlier than Mason had expected, which meant he was still upstairs making Emma's lunch when he heard the air brakes on the street below. He finished making the sandwich, turkey, no mustard. Mustard was apparently now the worst thing. Wrapped it in wax paper the way she liked, put it in her bag, and went downstairs to open the garage. The two men from the transport company were professional and efficient and treated the S1 with a care that was slightly different from how they'd treated it coming off the trailer 6 weeks ago, which told Mason that someone had briefed them on what they were handling. They loaded it gently, strapped it with padded restraints, and were done in 40 minutes. Mason signed the paperwork. The transporter pulled away from the curb and into Brooklyn traffic and was gone. He stood on the sidewalk in the November cold and watched it go. It felt strange. Not bad exactly, but strange. The particular strangeness of a space that has held something significant and is now just a space again. He went back inside and the garage looked bigger than it had the day before, which was an illusion but a persistent one. Emma came downstairs ready for school with her backpack on and found him standing in the middle of the empty bay where the car had been. It's gone? She said. Yeah. She stood beside him and looked at the empty space. Are you okay? I think so, he said. It's the right thing. It needed to go somewhere people could take care of it properly. Like the car version of a museum, she said. Sort of. First an auction, then probably a museum or a very serious collector who will keep it safe. She nodded, accepting this. Then she looked up at him. Are you nervous about the auction? He looked at the empty space where the S1 had sat for 6 weeks under a canvas cover while people with lawyers and black cars and $2.4 million offers tried to make him afraid. A little, he said. Yeah. You don't have to be, Emma said, with the complete confidence of someone who hasn't yet learned to hedge. You found it. Nobody can take that back. He drove her to school. On the way back, he stopped at the diner 2 blocks from the garage and ate breakfast sitting at the counter. Eggs, toast, bad coffee, the television in the corner showing morning news that he didn't listen to. The counterman, a heavy-set guy named Phil, who'd been working there since before Mason had moved to the neighborhood, refilled his coffee without being asked. You look like you slept wrong, Phil said. Something like that, Mason said. Car stuff? Car stuff. Phil nodded sagely, as if this explained everything, which in a neighborhood like this it mostly did. He went back to the griddle. Mason ate his eggs and thought about the next 3 weeks. The auction was scheduled for a Saturday, 22 days out. In the intervening time, the car would be in the custody of Harrington Cross Auction House in Midtown Manhattan, one of the 3 or 4 houses in the country with the infrastructure and client base to handle a sale of this magnitude. Wallace had a relationship with them going back 15 years, and he'd been the one to make the introduction, sitting in Mason's garage over bad coffee and walking him through the options with the patience of a man who understood that Mason had never sold anything for more than $40,000 in his life and needed to understand what he was agreeing to. Harrington Cross will take 18%, Wallace had said. On a sale of $8 million, that's $1.44 million in commission. That's the cost of doing it right. And doing it wrong? Mason had said. Doing it wrong means selling to Kane for 2.4 and spending the rest of your life knowing you left $6 million on the table. Wallace had picked up his coffee, decided against it, and set it back down. They have buyers I don't have access to, collectors who won't come out for anything less than this level of significance. And they know how to run a room in a way that generates competition, which is where the real money gets made. Mason had agreed. He'd signed papers that he'd had Patricia review, which she'd done with the thoroughness of someone who was personally offended by boilerplate language and intended to make it better. Now the car was on a transporter heading to Midtown, and Mason had 22 days to fill. He filled them the way he always filled time, with work, with Emma, with the small and specific demands of running a one-man shop in a neighborhood where people needed their cars and didn't have a lot of patience for delays. He did brake jobs and oil changes and a complicated transmission repair on a 15-year-old Subaru that took 3 days and tested his patience in ways that were therapeutic in their smallness. He answered emails about the auction from Wallace and from the Harrington Cross coordinator, a woman named Sandra Fitch, who was brisk and competent and communicated exclusively in complete sentences, which Mason respected. He did not talk to journalists. 3 of them found his shop number in the first week after the transporter left, and he was polite with all of them and said the same thing to each. I don't have anything to add beyond what's in the provenance documentation. The car speaks for itself. One of them wrote a piece anyway, sourced from unnamed collectors and Wallace's published work, and it ran in an automotive magazine with a photo of the auction catalog page showing Lot 47. The comments section had over 300 responses within a day, which Sandra Fitch sent him a link to and which he looked at for approximately 90 seconds before closing the browser. Wallace flew back from a second trip to Tucson. Diana Deckerman had agreed to provide a formal written statement, notarized, describing her father's direct involvement with the S1 and the conversations they'd had over his lifetime about the car's true fate. It was added to the provenance package that Harrington Cross would present to registered bidders during the preview period. On the Tuesday before the auction, Mason drove to Midtown to see the car. He hadn't seen it since the transporter took it. Harrington Cross was on the 44th floor of a building on Park Avenue, which was not where Mason spent a lot of his time, and the lobby had the particular atmosphere of a place that wanted you to understand immediately that serious money was at home here. He signed in, got a visitor badge, and was escorted by a young man named James to a private viewing room where the S1 had been placed for preview. What he saw stopped him in the doorway. They'd cleaned it, not restored it. There had been explicit instructions about that. Wallace had been emphatic. The car's patina was part of its authenticity, and any intervention beyond stabilization would damage both its integrity and its value. But they'd cleaned it carefully, removed 60 years of loose surface contamination, stabilized the rust where it was active, and placed the car on a display platform under precisely calibrated lighting that revealed its actual lines in a way that Mason had never seen before. It was still damaged, still incomplete, still missing the front fascia and the seat and the instrumentation, still the color of rust and old primer and time. But the shape of it, the pure, compressed, purposeful shape of a thing built for exactly one reason, was visible now in a way it hadn't been under the fluorescent lights of his garage or the indifferent lighting of the auction room where nobody had wanted it. It looked like what it was. It looked significant. James said something that Mason didn't catch, and Mason said, "Sorry?" And James said, "Is this what you expected?" "No," Mason said. "It's better than I expected." James nodded with professional satisfaction and left him alone with it, which Mason appreciated more than he could have expressed. He walked around it slowly. He looked at it from every angle. He found the brass tag from outside the car, visible through the gap in the wiring, and he stood there for a moment, confirming that it was still there, that the last 6 weeks hadn't been some elaborate dream sequence he was about to wake from. He looked at the welds on the frame rail. He thought about the machinist in Ohio, writing his account down decades after the fact, trying to put on paper what his hands had known. The car had been built to race. It had never raced. It had lived in a barn for decades, forgotten by almost everyone, known about by almost no one, searched for by a man in Brooklyn who had died before he found it. Now it was here, under careful lighting in a room on the 44th floor, about to be sold for more money than Mason could fully conceptualize, to someone who would presumably take care of it, and the masking tape was still in the cockpit, and Roy Deckerman's nickname was still legible, and the stamp near the transmission tunnel was still there. And all of it, every piece of evidence his father had ever hypothesized, was present and authenticated and documented. He stood next to it for 20 minutes without doing anything in particular. Then he said goodbye to James at the elevator and rode down to the lobby and walked out onto Park Avenue and stood in the November air for a moment before hailing a cab back to Brooklyn. The auction was on a Saturday. The night before, Mason could not sleep. This was not a surprise. He lay in bed until midnight, then gave up and went to the kitchen and made tea, which he almost never did because there was something about the idea of tea at midnight that felt less alarming than coffee. He sat at the kitchen table with his father's handwritten analysis in front of him, not reading it, just having it nearby. He thought about Carla. He thought about her the way he always did when something important was happening. Not with grief exactly, not anymore, but with the specific ache of wanting to tell her something. She would have had things to say about all of this. Specific, incisive, unsentimental things that would have made him see it differently and probably made him laugh at himself in the way she'd always been able to. She'd been sharper than he was in most situations, and entirely unbothered by the fact that he knew it. He thought about what she would have said about Amelia Sterling showing up in the garage with her hands in her pockets and her apology and her folded chair. She put the chair back. He could hear Carla saying, in that tone she had, "That means something. Pay attention." He was paying attention. He didn't know entirely what to do with what he was paying attention to, but he was paying attention. At 1:30 he went back to bed and slept for 5 hours, which wasn't enough, but would have to do. The morning of the auction, Emma woke up before him, which never happened. He found her in the kitchen already dressed, in the good sweater he'd bought her last winter that she'd declared too itchy 3 times and was apparently now wearing voluntarily. "You're up early," he said. "I wanted to look nice," she said, with the simplicity of someone for whom this was self-evidently the correct reasoning. "You look nice. I know." She poured herself a glass of orange juice with the careful concentration of someone who had recently been told the carton was heavy and to be careful. "Are a lot of people going to be there?" "Yeah, quite a few." "Rich people?" "Mostly." She thought about this while drinking her juice. "Are you nervous?" "You asked me that 3 weeks ago," Mason said. "I'm asking again because now it's actually happening." He made coffee and stood at the window. The morning was gray and cold, the street wet from overnight rain. A man was walking a dog that was approximately the size of a small couch, and the dog was extremely interested in something near the storm drain. "A little nervous," Mason said. "Not about the car, about being in a room full of people and waiting." "I'm good at waiting," Emma said. "I can wait with you." He turned and looked at her, sitting at the kitchen table in the good sweater with her orange juice, 6 years old, and completely serious about this. "Yeah," he said, "you can." They arrived at Harrington Cross at 10:15. The auction was at 11. The lobby was already occupied by people who moved through the space with the specific ease of those for whom rooms like this are unremarkable. Well-dressed, composed, speaking in the low, practiced tones of people who have learned that visible excitement about money is considered gauche in the circles they move in. Mason spotted 3 people he recognized from photographs he'd seen in industry coverage, major collectors whose names appeared in the same sentences as words like significant acquisition and undisclosed sum. He was wearing the best thing he owned, which was a dark gray suit he'd bought for Carla's funeral and worn exactly twice since. It fit him the same as it had then, which was imperfectly but adequately. His shoulder still ached. He'd had a coffee on the way and was regretting it. Sandra Fitch found them near the registration desk and shook Mason's hand with brisk efficiency. She was somewhere in her 50s, with the compressed energy of someone who has run events like this many times and has strong opinions about what makes them go wrong. She looked at Emma with what appeared to be genuine warmth beneath the professionalism. "You must be Emma," she said. "Yes," Emma said, and shook her hand with the solemnity of someone practicing adulthood. "We have seats for you in the front section," Sandra told Mason. "The car will be lot 3. We'll have 2 lots before it to warm the room up. When it comes, I'd encourage you to just let it happen. Let us do our job. Your instinct will be to watch the bidders, but watch the number instead." "Watch the number," Mason repeated. "Trust the number," Sandra said. "The number will tell you everything." She moved off toward something that needed her attention. Mason found their seats, actual seats, not standing room, which he appreciated, in the 3rd row from the front, slightly left of center, with a clear view of the podium and the display area where, currently, an early Ferrari sat under the same calibrated lighting he'd seen in the preview room. Wallace was already there, in the seat beside Mason's. He looked tired but alert, the way he'd looked every time Mason had seen him in the past 6 weeks. Like a man running on something other than sleep, some more sustainable fuel that he'd found in the work itself. "How are you?" Wallace said. "Standing," Mason said. "That's the right answer." He glanced at Emma, who was looking around the room with unconcealed curiosity. "She's good," he said, meaning it as a compliment. "She's the best person I know," Mason said. He wasn't performing this. He meant it the way you mean things that are simply true. Wallace nodded. Diana Deckerman was in the row behind them. Mason turned when Wallace touched his arm, and there she was, 73, small-framed, with white hair, and the particular stillness of someone who has lived long enough to know when something important is happening and how to be present for it. She was wearing a blue dress and holding a small clutch purse in both hands. "Mason Brooks," Wallace said. "Diana Deckerman." Mason stood. They shook hands. Hers was warm and dry and firm. "Your father," she said. "Henry told me about his work. 30 years. 30 years, Mason said. "My father would have—" She stopped, seemed to decide against finishing that sentence and substitute a different one. "Roy would have wanted to know someone like your father was looking, that the looking was happening." She held his gaze. "Thank you for not stopping." Mason didn't have anything adequate to say to that, so he just nodded, and she seemed to find that acceptable. He sat back down. Emma had been watching all of this with her full attention, and when he sat, she leaned over and said very quietly, "Who is she?" "The daughter of the man who drove the car," Mason said, just as quietly. Emma looked back at Diana Deckerman for a moment with an expression of profound seriousness. Then she turned back to the front and folded her hands in her lap, as if she understood that this was the kind of moment that required stillness. The first lot went for $340,000. The second lot, a significant post-war American race car with a strong competition history, generated real heat in the room, the kind of heat that comes from genuine conviction competing against genuine conviction, and sold for just under $2 million after 9 minutes of bidding that made the temperature in the room rise perceptibly. Then the auctioneer said, "Lot 3. The lights in the room shifted. Not dramatically, no theatrical dimming, just a subtle redirection of the lighting system toward the display area, where the curtain was drawn back and the S1 rolled forward on its display platform, under the light that had been designed specifically for it. The room changed. It was a subtle thing, but Mason felt it immediately, the way attention in a crowded space has a physical quality when it concentrates. 200 people had been looking at various things. Now 200 people were looking at one thing. The conversation stopped. Even the staff, who had presumably seen the car multiple times in the past 3 weeks, seemed to pause. Because in the right light, with the documentation behind it, and the knowledge of what it was and what it had survived, the Meridian S1 was extraordinary. Not pretty. It was still damaged and incomplete and rust-colored and bearing 60 years of what time does to things left alone. But extraordinary the way certain things are extraordinary when they have outlasted what was supposed to destroy them. Emma's hand found Mason's and held it. He looked at her. She was looking at the car with an expression he recognized. It was the expression she'd had in the garage that first morning, in her horse pajamas, when she'd reached out and touched the hood and got rust on her fingertips. Not disappointment now. Something else entirely. "It's real," she whispered. "Yeah," he said. The auctioneer's voice came through the room, measured and precise, introducing the lot with the economy of language that the significance of the object required. He cited the key provenance points, the metallurgical analysis, Wallace's authentication, the Deckerman family documentation. He noted the estimate. He opened the bidding. "Starting at $2 million, he said. "Do I have $2 million? 4 paddles went up simultaneously. Something in Mason's chest released, not dramatically, not in a way anyone around him would have noticed. Just a slow, quiet release, like pressure equalizing. It was going to be real. Whatever number came next, it was going to be real. The bidding moved quickly through 2 million, 2, 5, 3. It slowed between 3 and 4, as 2 of the 4 initial bidders dropped out and the remaining 2, a man in the second row whom Mason didn't recognize and a phone bidder whose face was visible on a monitor at the side of the room, being managed by a Harrington Cross representative, tested each other's resolve in increments of 250,000. At 4 million, a third bidder entered, which made the room's attention sharpen again. At 5 million, there was a pause long enough for Mason to breathe 3 full times, which he counted because it was something to do with his hands that wasn't squeezing Emma's too hard. At 5,250,000, someone in the back of the room that Mason couldn't see placed a bid. And this created a three-way competition that Sandra had evidently been hoping for because he saw her, from the corner of his eye, allow herself a small exhale. He was watching the number the way she'd told him to. He'd stopped watching the bidders, stopped trying to identify faces or read expressions, and just watched the number on the display board climb in increments that each represented more money than Mason had ever dealt with in his life, stacking on top of each other with a speed that made the total feel abstract, like something happening in a language he understood intellectually but couldn't feel the weight of. 6 million. Emma's hand tightened in his. 6,250,000. 6.5. 6,750,000. At 7 million, the back of room bidder dropped out, and it was back to 2. The man in the second row and the phone bidder, who Mason could see on the monitor, was a woman, somewhere in her 60s, whose face gave away nothing. 7,250,000. 7.5. Mason looked at Wallace. Wallace was watching the number board with his hands folded in his lap and his jaw set and his eyes very still, and he looked like a man who had waited 40 years for something to arrive and was now watching it arrive and was not going to let himself look away for a single second. 7,750,000. The man in the second row paused. The pause lasted long enough that the auctioneer looked at him directly, and the room's attention followed the auctioneer's gaze. And in that moment, Mason had the specific, uncomfortable experience of watching a number that represented his financial future depend on a stranger's willingness to raise a paddle. The man in the second row raised his paddle. 8 million. The phone bidder on the monitor said something to the Harrington Cross representative. The representative's expression didn't change, but she spoke into her phone and then looked at the auctioneer and gave a small nod. 8,250,000. The man in the second row looked at the number board. He looked at the car. He looked at the number board again. He lowered his paddle. The room went still. $8,250,000, the auctioneer said. Going once. Mason stared at the number on the board. Going twice. Emma squeezed his hand so hard it almost hurt. The hammer came down. The room erupted, not in the restrained, polite applause of a room full of people who consider visible excitement gauche. In actual, unconstrained noise, applause and a few voices, and the specific vibration of 200 people releasing the tension of the last 9 minutes simultaneously. Mason had not expected this. He had not expected a room full of serious collectors and industry professionals to respond to this the way they responded to it, and the unexpectedness of it hit him somewhere he hadn't fortified. He sat very still while the room made noise around him. Emma let go of his hand and turned to look at him with enormous eyes. "Dad," she said. "Dad." 8 million. "Yeah," he said. His voice came out strange, not broken, just compressed, like something had been sitting on it. $8,250,000, she said, with the precision of a child who has been told that the details matter. "Yeah," he said again. Behind him he could hear Diana Deckerman. She wasn't crying, not quite. She was making a sound that wasn't quite crying and wasn't quite laughing, somewhere between the two, the sound of a very old feeling finding its resolution. Wallace had his eyes closed. Mason looked at the car on the platform. At the S1, which had been lot 47 in an auction where nobody wanted it, which had cost him $11,500 and 6 weeks of pressure and 3 years of his father's ghost sitting in a filing cabinet waiting to be right. He thought about the man in the hospital hallway with his arms crossed, trying not to show how scared he was. Lucky doesn't come twice the same way. He thought about the masking tape. He thought about a man lying almost flat in the cockpit of this machine in 1959, driving it over a test course somewhere in upstate New York, knowing he was in something exceptional, pressing a strip of tape to the floor and writing his own nickname on it in block letters, a claim, a signature, and I was here. The auctioneer was moving toward the next procedural steps. Sandra Fitch had appeared at Mason's shoulder and was saying things in her brisk, complete sentence way that he was processing approximately 40% of. Wallace had opened his eyes and was now shaking someone's hand. Emma was standing on her seat. "Emma," Mason said, "you're going to fall." "I'm not going to fall," she said, with complete conviction, and looked out over the room with the unselfconscious satisfaction of someone who was exactly where she was supposed to be. He put his hand on her back so she wouldn't fall. The room was still moving around them, the aftermath of the auction doing what it does. People with phones, people with clipboards, people moving toward the administrative desk, to handle whatever needed handling when a thing this significant changes hands. Mason sat in the middle of it and let it move around him and felt, for the first time in 6 weeks, maybe for the first time in 4 years, the specific quality of stillness that comes when the thing you've been holding finally gets set down. Not peace, exactly. He wasn't sure peace was quite the right word for it, but something in that neighborhood, something adjacent. He was aware, somewhere at the edge of his attention, of someone stopping near his row. He looked up. Amelia Sterling was standing 3 feet away. She'd been in the room the whole time. He hadn't known that, hadn't seen her. She was in the 5th row, off to the right, which was outside his sightline during the bidding. She looked the same as she'd looked in his garage, coat, hands not quite knowing where to be, the composed expression doing its work while something underneath it did something else. She wasn't doing anything, just standing there. He looked at her. She looked at him. She gave a small nod. Not the professional kind, not the acknowledging a business associate kind. Something smaller and more specific. The kind of nod that means I know without requiring the words. He nodded back. She moved on. Emma had gotten down from the seat and was now standing with Diana Deckerman, to whom she appeared to be explaining something with considerable animation and hand gestures. Diana was listening with the full attention that old people sometimes give small children when they recognize that the child is saying something that matters, even if the content is not immediately clear. Wallace sat down next to Mason. "Well," he said. "Yeah," Mason said. They sat in the emptying room and watched the staff begin to move the S1 off the platform, carefully, with the padded restraints and the professional attention that the car was going to get for the rest of its existence, wherever it ended up. "Your father would have," Wallace started, and then stopped. "I know," Mason said. "I was going to say he would have had a strong opinion about the buyer," Wallace said. "He had strong opinions about where significant vehicles should end up. He would have wanted to know everything about the provenance of the buyer before he was satisfied." Mason almost laughed. "That sounds right. The buyer," Wallace said carefully, "is a consortium. 4 collectors, pooled resources. Their stated intention, and I have this on reasonable authority, is museum placement within 18 months, permanent public display." Mason looked at him. "He would have been okay with that," Mason said. "Yes," Wallace said. "I think he would have." Emma came back and sat in the chair beside him and announced that Diana Deckerman had promised to send her a photograph of her father standing next to the car from 1959, which Diana apparently had in a box at home and had only realized she had after Wallace's visit. Emma seemed to regard this as the most significant development of the entire morning, which made Wallace smile in a way that reached his eyes. Sandra Fitch appeared at Mason's shoulder again, and this time he was present enough to process what she was saying, which was that the administrative process would take approximately 4 to 6 weeks. The net proceeds after commission would be transferred upon completion, and she wanted to personally say that it had been a privilege to represent this sale. He shook her hand. He thanked her. He meant both things. Then he stood up, and Emma stood up, and the 3 of them, Mason, Emma, Wallace, made their way through the emptying room and out to the elevator and down to the lobby and out onto Park Avenue. The city was cold and ordinary and indifferent in the way that Mason had always found oddly comforting. Cabs, a delivery bike, 2 men arguing over a parking space on the corner with the practiced conviction of people who do this regularly. Emma slipped her hand into his. "So now what?" she said. He looked up at the building they'd just come out of, and then at the street, and then at his daughter standing next to him in her good sweater that she'd decided wasn't too itchy after all. "Now," he said, "we go home." "And then?" she said. He thought about the garage, the filing cabinet, the folder that said unverified in his father's cramped handwriting, the new locks on the garage doors that were still good locks, even though they no longer had anything particular to protect. "And then we figure out what's next," he said. She seemed to find this acceptable. They started walking. They went home. That was the whole of it, on the surface. A man and his 6-year-old daughter taking a cab back to Brooklyn on a Saturday afternoon in November. The city doing what it always did around them, indifferent and continuous. Emma fell asleep in the cab somewhere on the bridge, her head against Mason's arm, the good sweater bunched up under her cheek. He didn't move. He looked out at the water below the bridge, gray and cold and unremarkable, and let her sleep. The garage was exactly as he'd left it. The empty bay where the S1 had been was still empty, of course. He'd known it would be, had been knowing it all morning, but seeing it again after the auction had a different quality than it had that morning when the transporter took the car away. Then it had felt like a beginning. Now it felt like something that had completed its own sentence. He settled Emma on the couch with a blanket and went to the kitchen and stood at the window for a while without doing anything in particular. The street outside was ordinary. The man with the enormous dog was out again, the dog still interested in the storm drain, the man resigned to this as a permanent feature of his life. Mason made coffee. He sat at the kitchen table. He opened his father's folder, not the thin, unverified one, but the main Meridian file, the thick one, and he read through it for what he knew was the last time he'd read it this way, as an active document, as a working hypothesis. After today, it was an archive. After today, it was history rather than investigation, and there was a difference, even if you were the only one who could feel where the line was. He read slowly. He read the Ohio machinist's account, which he'd read so many times that he had sections of it memorized without having tried to. He read his father's annotations in the margins, small, precise, the handwriting of a man who trusted his own thinking enough to argue with himself on paper. He read the letters from the racing official, the photocopied photographs, the working theory at the back. He got to the last paragraph. I'd rather be wrong and still looking than right, and have stopped, and sat with it for a while. Then he closed the folder. Emma woke up at 4 and came to find him, still carrying the blanket, dragging it across the kitchen floor with the complete unself-consciousness of someone who doesn't care how they look in their own home. I'm hungry, she announced. I know. What do you want? Pasta, the cheese one. Again? It's the best thing, she said, with perfect finality. He made the pasta. They ate it at the kitchen table, and Emma talked about what she was going to tell her class on Monday, and Mason listened and made the right sounds and felt, underneath the ordinary texture of the evening, the particular weight of the day sitting somewhere he couldn't quite locate. Not heavy exactly, just present. The way significant things are present even when you're doing something as small as boiling water and grating cheese. Dad, Emma said, around a forkful of pasta. Yeah. Are we rich now? He thought about how to answer this. We will be, he said. When the money comes through. A few weeks. How rich? Rich enough that things are going to be different, he said carefully. Not different in, we're still us. We still live here. I still have the garage. You still go to the same school. She seemed to find this reassuring rather than disappointing, which told him something about the kind of kid she was. But we can fix the apartment, she said. The ceiling in the kitchen? He looked up at Texas. Yeah, he said. We can fix Texas. Good, she said. Texas is getting worse. She went to bed at 8:30 without being asked, which almost never happened and which Mason attributed to the emotional weight of the day landing on a 6-year-old system in a way that expressed itself as exhaustion rather than excitement. He stood in her doorway after turning out the light and listened to her breathing even out, and he stayed there longer than he needed to, which was a habit he'd had since she was born and saw no reason to stop. The message from Amelia Sterling arrived that night at 9:47, while Mason was sitting on the shop stool in the empty garage with a beer he'd been nursing for an hour. His phone lit up on the workbench. He almost didn't read it right away. He'd gotten into the habit over the past 6 weeks of treating his phone as something to be approached deliberately rather than reflexively, a response to the period of unwanted contact that now seemed to be fully behind him. But he saw her name in the preview and picked up the phone. The message was long. Longer than he'd expected from her, knowing what he knew about how she communicated. The economy of it, the precision. This was different. This was someone who had taken time with what they wanted to say and had decided that brevity would be the wrong choice. She wrote that she had been thinking in the weeks since she'd come to his garage about what it meant to be good at one thing and mistake that for being good at judgment in general. She wrote that she had built a company by the time she was 26, and that the speed of that had given her a confidence in her own assessments that she now understood was disproportionate to the actual evidence for it. She wrote that she had stood in front of a car in her own auction room and dismissed it in 4 seconds because it didn't look like what valuable things looked like in her experience, and that this was a failure not of knowledge, she'd never claimed to know cars, but of the more basic thing, which was knowing what you don't know. She wrote that she had watched him from the 5th row today and thought about what it cost to hold something for 6 weeks under the kind of pressure he'd been under and not bend. She wrote that she was aware that her intervention with Cain had been, in one reading, self-serving, protecting her auction house's reputation as much as protecting him, and that she wanted to be honest about that rather than pretend it had been purely altruistic. Then she wrote, "Your father spent 30 years on something that nobody else believed in. You held it for 6 weeks against people with a lot more money and leverage than you. I've been thinking about what that kind of faith costs, and I don't think I've ever paid that price for anything. I'm not sure I've ever had to. I think that's worth examining." Then she wrote, "Congratulations, Mason. The car found the right person to find it." He read it twice. Then he set the phone face down on the workbench and looked at the empty bay where the S1 had been. He thought about what it cost to hold something. He thought about it specifically, practically, the way he thought about mechanical problems. What were the actual components of it? What had it actually required of him? 6 weeks of bad sleep and camera feeds on his phone, and a black car parked outside, and a fabricated legal claim, and a smooth voice on the phone offering him a number that was large enough to be genuinely tempting. The shoulder that ached in cold weather, the surgery he'd been putting off, the mortgage on the garage that the bank had opinions about. He'd held it through all of that, and it hadn't felt heroic while he was doing it. It had just felt necessary, the way the next concrete thing always feels necessary when you're doing it rather than looking back at it. He picked up the phone and typed back, "Thank you for coming in person that day. It mattered more than the other thing." He meant the apology, not the Cain intervention. He wanted her to know that. Her response came fast, which told him she'd been waiting. "I know. That's why I did it that way." He put the phone in his pocket and finished his beer and went to bed. The administrative process took 5 weeks and 3 days, which Sandra Fitch had predicted within her 4 to 6 week window, and Mason spent those weeks doing exactly what he'd been doing before the auction: oil changes, brake jobs, the slow restoration work on the 1994 Honda Civic that he'd been at for 3 years and now had both the time and the money to actually finish properly. He paid his mortgage in full for the first time in 2 years. He called the orthopedic surgeon about his shoulder and made an appointment for January. He had Texas on the kitchen ceiling properly patched by a contractor who came on a Tuesday and was done in 4 hours. Emma watched the ceiling patching with deep personal interest and seemed to regard the disappearance of Texas as a satisfying conclusion to a long-running situation. The money arrived on a Thursday morning in December, transferred into the account Patricia had helped him set up for exactly this purpose. He was under a customer's Subaru when his phone buzzed with the bank notification, and he slid out, looked at the number on his screen, and then lay on the concrete floor of his garage for a moment looking at the ceiling. The number was $6,736,000. $8.25 million minus Harrington Cross's commission, minus Patricia's fees, minus the documentation and analysis costs that had accumulated over the past 6 weeks. $6,736,000 sitting in an account with his name on it. He got up, pushed his creeper under the workbench, and called Wallace. "It cleared," he said. "Good," Wallace said. He sounded unsurprised, but not indifferent. The tone of someone who had expected this outcome and still finds its arrival meaningful. "How do you feel?" "I'm not sure yet," Mason said honestly. "Ask me in a week." "That's the right answer," Wallace said. "Mason, I want to tell you something, and I want to say it plainly." "Okay. I've authenticated significant vehicles before. 3, maybe 4, in a career. It's rare. What makes this different, and I've been thinking about this since the auction, is that it almost didn't happen. If you hadn't been at that auction, if you hadn't had your father's research, if you'd sold to Cain, but..." A pause. "These things only get found when the right combination of knowledge and stubbornness walks past at the right moment. That's not lucky. That's the result of a man spending 30 years building something and passing it to someone who used it." Mason sat on the shop stool. Outside, the December street was doing its thing. "He would have liked you," Mason said. "My father. He had strong opinions about people, but he liked people who knew things and weren't embarrassed about knowing them." "High praise," Wallace said, and sounded like he meant that. They talked for a while about the car's destination. The consortium had confirmed museum placement talks with 3 institutions, and Wallace had been in contact with 2 of them about the Deckerman documentation, making sure Roy's story was part of the public record when the car went on display. Diana had sent the photograph she'd promised Emma. Roy Deckerman standing next to the S1 in what appeared to be an outdoor test facility in the summer of 1959, squinting slightly against the sun, one hand on the hood in a gesture that looked casual, but wasn't. Diana had written on the back, in a note addressed to Emma specifically, "This is the car finding its way home. Thank you for being there when it did." Emma had put the photograph on her wall between Biscuit and Star and the fast one. The surgery on Mason's shoulder was scheduled for January 14th. The orthopedic surgeon was a woman named Dr. Reyes, who had the specific quality of directness that Mason associated with people who deal in physical realities and have no patience for euphemism. She told him the tear had been there long enough that recovery would take 3 months minimum, possibly 4, and that he should have dealt with it 2 years ago. "I know," he said. "Why didn't you?" She was looking at his file, not at him, but her attention was complete. "Couldn't take the downtime. One-man shop." She looked up at him then. "And now?" "Now I can," he said. She nodded and went back to the file. January 14th. Don't eat anything after midnight the night before, and get someone to drive you. "My daughter's 6, he said. "Get someone else to drive you," she said. He asked Patricia, who drove him to the hospital and back and sat in the waiting area for 3 hours reading something on her tablet and didn't make a production of it, which he appreciated. The recovery was not smooth. It was 4 months of physical therapy and limited mobility and the specific frustration of being unable to do things that had been automatic for 12 years. He hired a mechanic, a 24-year-old named Darius, who came with a recommendation from a shop in Queens and turned out to be faster at diagnostics than Mason had expected and slower at customer interaction, which Mason worked on with him patiently because the diagnostic thing was harder to teach. Emma liked Darius immediately and without apparent reason, which Mason had learned to trust as a reliable indicator. The garage kept running. It ran differently, which took adjustment, but it ran. Spring came in the way spring comes to Brooklyn. Not gradually, but suddenly. 1 week still winter, and the next week people back on stoops, and the trees doing what they do almost overnight, and the light fundamentally different in quality and angle. Mason's shoulder healed enough by April that he was back on the floor, not full capacity but functional, and the relief of being useful with his hands again was more straightforward than he knew how to express to anyone who hadn't been in that particular absence. He'd been thinking, through the winter and into spring, about what he was going to do with the money. Not in the anxious way he'd thought about it during the 6 weeks before the auction, but methodically, practically, the same way he thought about a restoration. What does the thing actually need? What's cosmetic? What order do you work in? He secured Emma's education first, not in an abstract way, but specifically. A trust, set up by Patricia, structured to cover school through whatever Emma decided to pursue, and as far as she wanted to go. Then the mortgage on the garage paid off in full, which felt like removing a physical weight from somewhere behind his sternum that he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten it was separate from himself. Then the surgery and the recovery, which he'd already handled. He also set aside a specific amount, smaller than the others, but thought through carefully, for something he'd been turning over since Wallace had said it at the auction. Your father spent 30 years on something that nobody else believed in. He called it, in his own head, the research fund, which was not a creative name but was accurate. He'd talked to Wallace about it over the winter during one of their now regular phone calls. They'd developed an easy shorthand by this point, 2 people who had been through something significant together and found they had more to talk about than just the car. The idea was simple: money available to serious independent researchers in American motorsport history who were working on things that didn't have institutional backing. The kind of work his father had done. The kind of work that happened in kitchen tables and storage units and filing cabinets labeled unverified by people who kept going not because anyone was paying them to, but because they believed the looking itself was the point. He would have said it was too small, Mason told Wallace about the amount. He would have said it wasn't his money to have opinions about, Wallace said. Same thing, with him. Wallace was quiet for a moment. It's the right thing to do with it, Mason. I know, Mason said. That's why I'm doing it. On a Saturday in May, almost exactly 7 months after the auction, Mason drove Emma to Philadelphia. Wallace had arranged it. The car was going on permanent display at the American Motor Heritage Institute, and the opening of the exhibit was that Saturday, and Mason had been invited, which Emma had taken to mean they were both invited, which Mason had not corrected. They drove down in the F-150 with the cracked dashboard that Mason had now had long enough that fixing it felt like a betrayal. Emma ate a bag of pretzels and asked questions for the first hour and a half, and then fell asleep, which was her standard road trip configuration. The museum was a serious institution in an old industrial building that had been converted with the kind of care that lets the bones of the original structure show through the renovation. High ceilings, concrete floors, natural light where possible. The exhibits arranged in a way that felt chronological without being rigid, story-based rather than just chronological. The S1 was in a room by itself, not a large room. It wasn't that kind of museum, the kind that uses scale to substitute for meaning. A modest room, well lit, with the car on a low platform in the center and the provenance documentation arranged on the surrounding walls in panels that were designed to be read, not just looked at. Photographs. The metallurgical report, Wallace's authentication, the Deckerman family statement, with Diana's signature at the bottom in a hand that was still firm and legible, and one photograph, enlarged and mounted on the wall directly behind the car. Roy Deckerman at the test facility in 1959, squinting into the sun, one hand on the hood, looking like a man who knew he was in the presence of something that deserved to be remembered. Emma stopped in the doorway. She looked at the photograph on the wall, and then at the car, and then at the photograph again, making the connection between the two, the man in the old photograph and the machine in front of her, with the particular careful attention she brought to things she wanted to understand properly. "That's him," she said, "from the picture Diana sent me." "Yeah," Mason said. "He doesn't look like a famous person," she said. "Most people don't," Mason said. "Most people just look like people." She walked into the room. She walked around the car the way Mason had taught her. Slowly, looking, not touching, giving it the space to be looked at. She stopped at the back and read the information panel about the S1 specifications, moving her lips slightly the way she did when she was reading something she wanted to retain. She stopped at the panel with the Deckerman statement and read that too, slowly. Mason stood in the doorway and watched her do this, and felt something that he didn't have a clean word for. Not pride exactly, though there was pride in it. Not grief, though there was grief in it too. His father not here, Carla not here, Roy Deckerman not here, all the absence that surrounds the thing that managed to be present. It was something that contained all of those things without being reducible to any of them. Wallace joined him in the doorway. "Diana couldn't make it," Wallace said quietly. "She wanted to. Her knee. The travel was too much this time." "I know," Mason said. "She called me yesterday." "She told me what she said to you." Mason nodded. Diana had called on Friday evening, and they'd talked for 45 minutes, which was longer than Mason had expected and shorter than it felt. She'd told him about her father, so not the racing parts, which Wallace had documented, but the other parts. The way Roy had been in the years after the S1 project ended, the quiet frustration of a man who had touched something extraordinary and then had to pretend it hadn't happened. The way he'd talked about the car in the last years of his life. Less as a loss, more as something held in trust. Something he believed would surface eventually when the right person came along. He never talked about finding it himself, Diana had said. He always talked about it like it was going to be someone else. Like his job was just to remember it clearly enough that when someone finally looked in the right place, there'd be enough trail to follow. Mason thought about his father's filing cabinets, the index cards, the cross-references, the Ohio machinist and the letter from the racing official and the photographs taken on a 35mm camera and carefully preserved for decades. Two men, his father and Roy Deckerman, neither of them knowing the other existed, both of them holding up their end of something that would only make sense when someone came along and connected the parts. "My father never drove a race car in his life," Mason said to Wallace. "He was terrible at anything that went fast. He got carsick on the highway, but he spent 30 years on that car." "Because he believed it existed," Wallace said. "Because he believed it mattered that someone was looking," Mason said. "That's different." Wallace was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "That is different." Emma had come back to the doorway. She stood between the two of them and looked back at the car one more time from the doorway. The full view, the way you look at a painting when you step back to get the whole thing at once. It looks right here, she said. Like it's supposed to be here. Yeah, Mason said. It does. She slipped her hand into his, and they stood there, the three of them. Mason, Emma, Wallace, and looked at the Meridian S1 in its room, in its museum in the May light coming through the high windows. And it was what it had always been, rust and damaged metal and 6 decades of time. And it was also exactly what his father had always believed it was. And there was no contradiction between those two things. They drove home late in the afternoon, hitting the usual traffic coming out of Philadelphia, and sitting in it on the highway with the windows cracked and the radio on low. Emma was quiet for a while, which was unusual. She was looking out her window at the cars going past in the other lane, the ones heading south, going wherever people go on Saturday afternoons in May. "Dad?" she said. "Yeah." "Do you think there are other things like that? Like the car that nobody's found yet?" He thought about it. He thought about his father's filing cabinets, about the other folders in the drawers, the ones he hadn't opened in months, the ones he'd never finished reading because the Meridian folder had always been the one that pulled his attention. "Yeah," he said. "Well, probably." "Are you going to look?" He hadn't decided this. He'd been not deciding it for months, which was itself a kind of decision, but not a committed one. The garage was running, the shoulder was healing, Emma was good, the money was handled. He didn't need to do anything. He could just run the shop, raise his daughter, let the filing cabinet sit. He thought about the masking tape. Decker in block letters on the floor pan of a car that wasn't supposed to exist. He thought about his father standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee he'd made, because thinking required something to do with his hands. He thought about what Wallace had said. The right combination of knowledge and stubbornness, like it was a formula, like it was reproducible. "Maybe," he said. Emma looked at him. "That means yes," she said. "It means maybe. When you say maybe, it means yes. You said maybe about getting the camera system, and we got the camera system. You said maybe about pasta 2 weeks in a row, and we had pasta both times." He couldn't argue with the empirical record. "It means I'm thinking about it." She turned back to the window, apparently satisfied with this. The traffic moved in fits and starts the way highway traffic does. The collective organism of it finding its own rhythm without anyone coordinating it. The light was getting low and gold the way May light gets in the late afternoon, lying flat across the highway and making ordinary things briefly beautiful. "Grandpa would want you to look," Emma said. She wasn't pushing it. She said it the way she said things that were simply true, without inflection, as a fact being entered into the record. "Yeah," Mason said. He probably would. They drove the rest of the way home mostly in silence, the comfortable kind that doesn't need filling. Mason thought about the filing cabinets, about the other folders, about what it meant to keep faith with something even when you didn't know if it was going to go anywhere. He thought about his father's line, "The most human thing I know how to do." He'd read it so many times it lived in his head the way certain things do, available without effort, part of the furniture. He understood now, more fully than he had even at the auction, what his father had meant by it. Not the searching specifically. The refusal to accept that something valuable could simply vanish without leaving a trace. The insistence that the world contains more than is visible, and that looking, seriously, methodically, without giving up, is not naivety or obsession, but the most basic form of respect you can pay to the things that matter. Some people live their whole lives in the visible. They take things at face value and move on quickly and never sit on a concrete floor with a flashlight looking at a stamp on a frame rail because some dead man's files suggested it might mean something. Mason understood why people lived that way. It was easier. It was faster. It produced a lot fewer nights of bad sleep and fabricated legal claims and black cars parked outside your garage. But it also meant you walked past Lot 47 without looking. He thought about Amelia Sterling. He'd thought about her message many times since November, specifically the line about paying a price for faith. She'd said she wasn't sure she'd ever had to, and he believed that was honest. She'd spent her life in the visible too, but she'd said it plainly rather than defending it, which was a different thing. He respected the plainness of it. They'd had coffee twice since the auction. Not dates. Neither of them had used that word, and he wasn't sure either of them was in a position to use that word, with his particular grief still having its own address somewhere in his chest, and her particular life being what it was. Just coffee. Two people who'd been through something unusual together, finding out if there was something worth talking about on the other side of it. There was, it turned out. She was sharper in a kitchen than she was in a boardroom, which surprised him. She asked questions that were specific rather than polite, and listened to the answers rather than waiting for her turn. She told him about her father, the software systems, the 3 hours of architecture patterns, and he told her about his, and they'd sat with the parallel of it for a moment without turning it into anything more than what it was. Emma had met her once, briefly, when Amelia had stopped by the garage on a Thursday afternoon with the stated purpose of returning a book she'd borrowed from Wallace that Wallace had told her to give to Mason, which was the kind of convoluted errand that Mason suspected Wallace had engineered deliberately. Emma had assessed her with the full weight of her attention for approximately 30 seconds, and then gone back to the drawing she was working on, which Mason interpreted as conditional acceptance pending further evidence. He didn't know what any of it was going to be. He didn't try to know. He'd learned something from 6 weeks of waiting for an auction, from a lifetime of watching his father keep faith with something unprovable, that the future has a shape that's different from what you imagine for it, and that your job is not to predict it, but to be present for it when it arrives. The highway opened up on the far side of the traffic, and they moved faster, the light now almost gone, the city beginning to appear on the horizon in the way cities appear at dusk, lights coming on in patterns that look random until you've seen them enough times that they feel like recognition. Brooklyn resolved itself from the abstraction of the skyline into the specific bridges, specific buildings, specific streets that led to a specific garage with new locks, and a camera system and a filing cabinet full of his father's work, and one empty drawer where the Meridian folder used to live before it graduated from unverified to something that didn't need a label anymore. He parked on the street. Emma was already unbuckled before the engine was off, which she knew was against the rule, but which he didn't enforce when she was tired, because some rules existed for situations, and some situations existed beyond the rules. She climbed out and stood on the sidewalk and looked up at the building. Their building, the apartment above the garage, the kitchen with the newly patched ceiling and the refrigerator with the horses on it, with the expression of someone returning to something that has been exactly where they left it. "Home," she said. "Home," he agreed. She went inside. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment and looked at the garage, at the sign above the door that said Brooks Auto in the letters that had faded from dark green to gray, and that he had decided somewhere in the spring he was not going to repaint. Not because he was sentimental about the fading, he wasn't, particularly, but because the fading was accurate. Because Brooks Auto had been his father's name first, and the weathering of it was honest about how long the name had been out there, holding up to the weather. He went inside. The kitchen was exactly as they'd left it. The table had Emma's school things on it from Friday. The ceiling was smooth and white where Texas used to be, which still looked slightly foreign. He stood there in his coat, not taking it off yet, just standing in the specific weight of the specific evening. He thought about his father. He thought about Roy Deckerman squinting in the summer sun with his hand on the hood. He thought about Diana in Tucson keeping a box of letters for 50 years because some things are worth keeping even when you don't know yet what they're for. He thought about Wallace on the phone from Tucson saying he always said it would come back. He thought about Emma on the seat in the auction room with her eyes wide saying, "Dad. Dad. 8 million. He thought about the other folders in the filing cabinet, the ones he hadn't opened yet. He took off his coat. He put the kettle on. He sat down at the kitchen table and folded his hands on the surface and looked at the smooth ceiling and thought about what his father had known that had taken Mason 32 years to learn. That the most important things are usually the ones that arrive in ordinary forms, that patience is not the same as passivity, that the act of looking, really looking without giving up, is itself a form of argument against the world's tendency to forget. The kettle boiled. He made tea, which he almost never did, which he'd started doing on nights when he was turning something over that needed the specific quietness of it. He sat back down. He thought about whether he was going to look. Emma's voice came from upstairs. "Dad, can you come up? I can't find the book Diana sent." "It's on your nightstand," he called back. A pause. "It's not on my nightstand." "Check under the horse pajamas." A longer pause, then, "Oh, He smiled at the kitchen ceiling. He thought, yes, he was going to look. Not tonight. Tonight was for the tea and the quiet and the specific texture of a day that had been, in its way, the ending of something that his father had started 30 years ago and he'd been living inside of without fully knowing it. Tonight was for letting that settle. But there were other folders, other index cards, other storage units somewhere, other barns in other counties, other things that looked like nothing to people who didn't know what they were looking at. And he knew what he was looking at. He'd always known. He just needed to find the car to understand that the knowing was the inheritance. Not the money, not the outcome, not the $8 million sitting in an account with his name on it. The knowing. The 30 years of files and cross-references, and a man at a kitchen table who refused to call something verified until the evidence was complete, who passed that refusal to his son. The way you pass useful things, without ceremony, just by doing it in front of someone long enough that they absorb it. Mason sat at the table and drank his tea and let the city do what it always did outside, indifferent and continuous, full of ordinary surfaces under which extraordinary things were waiting for someone willing to look. He wasn't afraid of the looking. He'd never been afraid of the looking. That, in the end, was the whole story.